Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Today, we're diving into a brand new story, The White-Winged Devil Part 3 by Nanokawi. Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Chapter 13. There was a rustling of leaves that nearly alerted their prey as the girls climbed through the trees and bushes, trying to keep low as they approached the men's bathing pool. Lily in particular looked quite hungry as Lefia tried to reason with her. Lily, Raoul would kill us if he found out. She futtered and replied with a sisterly pat on the shoulder. Look, it's just business, okay? We need to make sure they are all in top order for the return journey, or else we could all be compromised. Can't let Master Bell go back without a thorough inspection, right? Lefia was about to respond until suddenly the pool came into sight and her breath hitched. All of the girls found their hiding spots and began to ogle the men of the Loki familiar, but Lefia couldn't help but let her eyes roam around looking for Bell. He wasn't there, at least not in this pool, and Lily looked a bit put out until Lefia whispered, spilling her blood on the altar of peeping as her loins won out over her morals. There's another pool, the executives use it sometimes. Lily grinned as she followed Lefia through the forest, replying with a grin. See, this is why I brought you along. It's teamwork, plain and simple. They suddenly came to a halt, and Lefia motioned for Lily to stay silent as she peeked over a bush to see a striking sight. It was Bell, nude to the bone, standing in the middle of the pool with his back to her as he scrubbed his arm. Thankfully that was all she could see, but Lily peeked over and suddenly her hungry expression led to a nosebleed. Lefia would have commented on it, but she had to admit, this was kind of exciting. Eventually Lefia went to peek over again, and was surprised to see that Bell was staring directly at them. Her eyes widened in fear and she dove behind the bush again, but nothing came of it until suddenly they heard Bell shout in surprise. Miss Tuju. Lily's eyes widened in turn as another figure walked out into the clearing as Bell sank into the water, covering his chest nervously. Sure enough, Koneko Tuju had entered the clearing and was walking towards Bell. She didn't seem to have noticed them, or rather, didn't address them as she said aloofly. So, you made it. You're injured. The Loki familiar has an encampment, and someone led you here. Bell seemed to gulp as he explained nervously. They asked me to join a Goliath-killing party and... Koneko crossed her arms, not particularly bothered by his lack of dress as she asked sardonically. So, do you finally see what those Loki adventurers do? They lie, cheat, and they'll abandon you if it suits them. He didn't immediately respond, and Lefia began to feel a slight unease in her stomach. They've. Koneko continued with a biting voice. You have to have met their goddess at some point. You know what she's like. Even if they seem friendly, they'll stab you in the back. We can't trust them, at all. If they had organized a party to kill the Goliath, why didn't they offer you a healing spell? Lefia gripped her hands tightly, and she felt her shoulders shaking. She had wanted to cast a healing spell, Loki knows she wanted to, but Lily had told her to rest her mind. There was a long moment of silence until Koneko continued, a promising smile on her face. I understand you may have made friends there, but this is coming from experience. Join me, get your equipment from the camp and tell them to return without you. I promise to train you, your potential is astounding after all. We'll go down to the lower floors together, you have my word. Bell gulped before replying nervously. Miss Tuju, I want to speak my mind, may I? Lily frowned at the submissive voice he was using. Even with Ria's, his mistress, he didn't sound like this. Koneko nodded, looking at him warily before Bell continued. I know you don't trust them, and truth be told, some of them are less than kind sometimes. Lefia felt a small tear of frustration form in the corner of her eye. Of course he wouldn't forgive her just like that. What reason did he have to? However, she could hear the smile in his voice as he replied. But, they asked me for help. There was a long moment of silence before Koneko spoke up derisively. You're a fool. What happens when you ask them for help? When it comes down to you or their lives, who do you think they will save? Bell gulped before standing up again, though his waist never crested the water. I won't let it come to that. There's always a way out, a way to save everyone. Koneko near screamed in frustration as she stamped her foot, causing a small crater to form at the point of impact. What about Ria's? What about Kuroka? Why isn't anybody saving them? Tell me, Bell Cranel, when everything comes down to you, how can you ask others to place their faith in your abilities? How do you make sure you never lose a fight again? Suddenly Belle understood why she had been staying down in Riviera like this. It wasn't just to become stronger, it was to become dependable. Someone that Rias could rely on, that didn't have to worry about what would happen if they lost a fight. I train, I figure out a plan, and I ask for help, so that even if we all lose, we can never say we didn't give it our all. Koneko gritted her teeth before turning her head. You're absolutely worthless, trash even. You came down into the dungeon looking for a fairy tale that doesn't exist. Lefia suddenly wanted to slap this newcomer. That was completely unfair. She hadn't been there when Belle had made the victory play in the fight. She was about to stand up before Lily did so, walking out into the clearing with her wings spread wide. Koneko turned to her and was about to speak before Lily spoke with a clear, authoritative voice. Lilyruka Ard, pawn of Ria's Gremory. She's requested your presence on the surface. You are to depart immediately. The cat girl stared at her analytically before turning around and walking off without another word. Lily sighed in relief before suddenly feeling a pair of eyes on her back, and she turned around nervously to see Belle looking at her in shock. Lily. What are you doing here? Suddenly she flushed red and pointed back at the bush where Lefia's head was poking over it, only to gulp when she realized that Belle had noticed her too. It was her idea. She wanted to peek on Master Belle, and she led me here. Lefia stood up and screamed back. It was not my idea. It was absolutely hers. You have to believe me. Belle dipped lower before shuffling nervously in the water, looking particularly feminine as he asked nervously. But you wanted to peek. Suddenly Lefia felt a thud in her heart as she stared at his form, a certain thud that only one person had elicited from her before. Oh no. Before they could stop her, Lefia made a tactical retreat, or rather, ran away screaming as her world collapsed around her. Belle wanted to call after her, but thought better of it as he sunk into the water again looking a bit put out. Lily grinned at her reaction before turning back to Belle. So, mind if I get in? She had to dive in to make sure he didn't drown as he fainted, but she did decide to stay in with him, letting him sleep on her shoulder. Just until her clothes dried, of course. Timeskip Belle stood in the courtyard of Twilight Manor with Lily, his wings healed up as he and Lily waited to be dismissed. The rest of the expedition was sitting around, lounging or getting further medical treatment. Lefia had retreated to about the furthest away from Belle as she could get, refusing to meet his eyes as she spoke to Riveria. They were about to go and speak to Raoul, wondering if it was okay for them to leave before they heard a voice call out excitedly to them. Tiona, AIS, and Finn were approaching, the former waving to them before Belle waved back with a nervous grin. They arrived and she exclaimed excitedly. We just heard about the irregular. That sounds so cool. I can't believe I didn't get to watch. Belle laughed nervously, not exactly remembering the harrowing fight the same way. Finn spoke up next, an impressed smile on his face. I'm glad that you signed on, both of you. If you hadn't been there, there could have been a wipe. We also heard about you and Lefia. The boy gulped, wondering exactly what he was talking about. The issues on the trek down to the 17th floor. The teamwork during the fight. The peeping. Finn grinned as he explained. The initial troubles and what you did to stop her from getting hurt, I'll leave. Riveria to punish those with wandering eyes. Even if she wronged you, at our goddess' request no less, you sacrificed yourself to keep her from getting seriously hurt. You did more than was asked of you, and for that, Finn snapped his fingers, and a supporter walked over and passed them a large bundle with a large sack of coin. 250,000 Valis and the drop item, a black Goliath hide. I trust this will be enough to forget the finer points of the expedition. Belle gaped at the massive amount of cash, but before he could insist they couldn't take it, Lily took the bundle with a nod. Thank you. The captain nodded before turning to AIS with a softer smile. I believe you had something to say to him, AIS? I'm sure they want to get home. Ari's cheeks turned a little bit red, and Belle couldn't believe she actually had the capacity to make such an expression as she said. Thank you for saving Lefia. She is precious. Belle sighed in relief before grinning and scratching the back of his head. Of course, I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Before he could continue, a sudden missile shot between them and Belle blinked in surprise when he saw Lefia holding out her arms as if protecting a shocked AIS. Stay away from Miss Wallenstein. There was a long moment of silence and it looked as if Riveria was about to storm over and scold her before Lily grinned playfully and spoke up. What? Getting jealous of her already? Wow girl, you're falling faster than I am. Lefia's blush traveled noticeable up her face as she stomped on the ground and replied childishly. Oh, of course not. I'd never FFFFAFAFA. The words died in her throat as she looked up at a curious Belle, and she shuffled nervously in her feet before Tiona grinned and pulled her back. Got something to say, Leffy? Come on, spit it out. The elf cleared her throat before curtsying to Belle, a surprisingly respectful change of pace considering her prior attitude. I hope we can work together again. Belle, and I'm very sorry for my actions yesterday. They were foolish. Belle smiled happily, glad that she seemed to have mellowed out a bit. Extending his hand to her, he said as steam began to bellow out of her ears. No problem, it's in the past. I hope we can work together to Leffia. She took his hand, but even after a few seconds she didn't seem to want to let it go. Riveria and Finn's eyes widened in shock when they saw the contact but didn't speak up, as did Ais and Tiona. Belle eventually did, noting with a blush of his own. Leffia, why you can let go now. Indeed, she had been gripping onto his hand while looking down at it like it was the most degenerate, explicit act she'd ever seen before letting go of it like it had scalded her. She looked between all the amused faces before promptly screaming her head off and running away as Belle looked down at the hand with a small smile. Lily sighed and nudged him suggestively. Well then, hand-holding A. What would Riaz think? He yelped before turning to pout at her as Finn chuckled. I believe that is something that you wish to discuss at home. Raoul. The leader rushed over from where he'd been talking with a few other members, and he said apologetically. Sorry, got caught up. You guys are off then. Belle and Lily nodded, and Raoul extended his hand with a serious expression, and Belle took it with a nod and they exchanged a firm handshake. You two were indispensable down there. If you ever want to sign on again, we'd be glad to have you. The devil grinned and responded confidently. I'd be glad to. It was a pleasure working with you, Raoul. Lily nodded along though she didn't voice her willingness. They turned to leave before they realized somebody was standing at the gates, tapping her foot with a serious expression, and Belle gulped. It was Riaz, and she looked rather displeased as she stormed over and said in a deadly calm voice. Belle, Lily, did I or did I not set a curfew for him? Did I or did I not spend last night tearing my hair out in worry? Now then, did I or did I not hear from Koneko that he had been grievously injured? Belle gulped as Finn laughed from the side. Apologies, Miss Gremory. Had I known Riaz turned to glare at him, and even Finn stepped back nervously before she reaffixed her expression on Belle. Now then, mister. No dungeon exploration for you for the next week. You will be staying home, and if I even catch a whiff of that tavern you frequent on you, then Aquino will be the one to decide your punishment. His expression turned fearful and even Tiona winced. That sadist. Damn Argonaut, good luck. Riaz gave her a passing look before sighing and pinching the bridge of her nose. Do you require them anymore, Daimna? I would like to get them back home as soon as possible. Finn gave Belle a small look of pity, though there was a healthy amount of mirth too. No, they have received their pay. Good day, and good luck. Belle gave him a betrayed expression as Riaz began to lead them away. Lily fell in step with him and whispered apologetically. Thanks for taking the heat, Master Belle. Her back straightened in fear as Riaz cut in. Don't think you're off the hook, Lily. I just haven't decided your punishment yet. Don't make me get inspired by Aquino. Lily's expression of terror didn't help Belle's own state as they were marched back to the peerage's house. When they got inside, even Aquino didn't greet them as they were forced up and into Riaz's room. They walked inside, and Riaz locked the door before launching herself at them. They had to work together to hold her up as she pulled them deep into an embrace, shouting in anguish. And never do that again. Do you know how terrified I was for you too? This was your first F-floor boss, and I. Lily looked up at Belle in shock as he just wrapped his arms around both of them and whispered apologetically. I'm sorry, Riaz. The prum reciprocated the embrace as she added. Me too. Eventually the girl had finished sobbing before wiping her eyes and standing up straight, crossing her arms as she looked to the side, trying to become serious once more. All right, we're going to the office so you can tell all of us about what happened. They went down and Belle was surprised when he felt Aquino dash to him and wrap her arms around him. You idiot. I think someone's in for some punishment for frightening Riaz and I. Belle stiffened in fear as Aquino giggled darkly. Sat on the sofa, refusing to look at either of them, was Koneko. He wanted to speak to her desperately, but they hadn't exactly left each other on good terms. They got sat down as Riaz and Aquino took their places. Now then, start from when you began yesterday morning. They took turns explaining everything that had occurred, though Belle left out what Leffia had done in the run-up to the boss fight. He felt a certain kinship with the girl, and he respected her for her fierce protectiveness over AIS, Not to mention he had been a little flattered that she'd wanted to peep on him. Or rather, the grandfather in his brain called it a triumph of masculinity. Eventually they finished off with returning to Twilight Manor, and Rhea sighed and crossed her arms with a pout. I can't even punish you too. That was the best outcome. All right, I think I have some amendments to your punishment, Belle. He perked up excitedly as Rhea's began, her index finger pointed to the ceiling. First of all, you are still not allowed to go back down for a week. I don't think my heart could take much more. Secondly, the middle finger went up as she continued. I shall accompany you outside should you wish to do any shopping. I'll ask my brother to lighten my workload. You are still forbidden from going to that tavern alone, but if you are accompanied by myself or Aquino, I will allow it. Third, the ring finger went up as she grinned excitedly. You have to come with me to a supernatural ball. Belle was quite surprised by that, but didn't complain. Those were much better terms than before. She turned to Lily and huffed before speaking up. I can't really keep you cooped up here. All right, you have to assist Aquino with anything she asks until you and Belle can return to the dungeons. Also, since I haven't taken much from you two since you joined, I have decided on your first contribution. Lily gripped her backpack straps nervously, wondering exactly how much she'd be spending. She'd gotten complacent since she'd been released from Soma's Familia. Of course there'd be a peerage tax involved. I want to renovate one of the rooms into a bathtub, a big one. I want it to be big enough for all of us to fit in. The girl had a certain gleam in her eyes as Lily gaped. W8. W-Y. Rhea clapped her hands excitedly as she replied, a knowing smirk in her eyes. Oh come on, it'll be great. Poor Aquino can only go to bath houses, and I don't want to keep putting down the entrance fee for the divine pools. It'll be so much nicer having one here for our personal use. Not to mention, you seem to have a good bit of luck with baths. Lily's face turned red and wistfully lustful all at the same time as Belle subconsciously covered his chest. I'll have a word with the Goibnu Familia. Lily stumbled away with a newfound gleam in her eyes as Rhea's giggled with Aquino excitedly. Eventually Koneko butted in, a confused expression on her face. Rhea's, what happened? You're happy again. Rhea's clapped her hands and looked over to Belle with a loving expression in her eyes that made him feel a bit more at ease. Well, a certain someone has made my future a lot brighter. Belle won a suitor's gambit for me. Koneko's eyes widened as she looked at the boy in a new light as he scratched his cheek nervously. Surprise. Rhea's giggled as she began to explain what had occurred. At some point Aquino had left the room and returned with tea and a tray of treats, though once the tea had been poured the treats were placed exclusively in front of Koneko. Once she had been brought up to speed, no omissions, Koneko grabbed a pastry and began to nibble at it thoughtfully. They were silent as she did so, and Belle had to admit she looked particularly cute as she did so, though her curious amber eyes locked onto him made him with a piercing stare. Eventually she finished the treat before speaking up. I'm sorry about last night. Her cadence reminded him a little bit of AIS as he replied dismissively. Oh, it's fine. Koneko didn't speak up for a long moment before Rhea spoke up helpfully. You know, he hasn't asked to see his status once. It was like she was some kind of couples therapist as Koneko looked at Belle in surprise. You didn't. Belle gulped before explaining nervously. Well, you told me not to so. I didn't. It was to teach me to take threats seriously, right? Koneko looked between him and Rhea's in amazement before folding her arms and nodding. Yes, but I thought you'd want to see it. You've done well, better than I'd given you credit for. Rhea shared a look with Aquino as Belle smiled excitedly. Koneko, I know you two didn't get off to a good start, but maybe you can learn to get along. Belle, is there anything you want to ask her? While there was the obvious question of why she hated Loki Familia, Belle decided on a safer question. What re the lower floors like? How far down have you gone? Koneko gave him a long look before replying shortly. They're cold, and the monsters are smarter. I've fought the floor boss Udius on the 27th floor, but I've been to floor 39. Belle looked at her in amazement, and Rhea's giggled before standing up. Well, that should be all for now. I'm sure we'll get time to talk in the future, but for now, can you follow me, Belle? Oh, Aquino, send off that reply to the Apollo Familia. Belle followed Rhea's obediently as they walked back upstairs. She entered her room and locked the door behind her before crossing her arms and saying in an authoritative voice, Strip. He looked at her like she was insane before Rhea's replied uncompromisingly, though with a small sadness in her eyes. I told you exactly what would happen if you tried to escape my affections, and my bed was rather cold without you last night. Lost time must be made up. Also, I'm sure you want to stat up. Stripping nervously, he was left exclusively in his underwear as Riaz did the same. Thankfully she followed his lead and didn't get fully nude, though she pouted at his underwear before giving up on it. They walked over to the bed and Belle sat down, shivering slightly when he felt her cool fingers on his back as the red light began to fill the room. They were silent as she went about her work, but when the light faded, he was surprised when she said with a soft, proud voice, "Congratulations, you're level 3. Belle gaped back at her as Riaz hugged the status sheet to her chest. "And no. But I didn't even dash." Riaz grinned at him as she tossed the sheet to the side, letting it flutter to the ground face down as she explained. "Excelia doesn't lie. It is your story, your experience. You overloaded your container during that fight, and your body has adapted. That Lefia girl must be something special." He gulped, wondering if she was angry at him before Riaz giggled and nudged him in the side. "As long as you don't forget me. Or kiss her at our wedding, I guess, but I doubt I need to worry about that." He nodded silently until Riaz sighed and leaned back against the wall and pulled the duvet over them like a blanket as she laughed at his surprise. Belle was shocked when she lay her head against his shoulder like a pillow and sighed in contentment. "Damn it all, Belle, am I really not that attractive? A boy your age should be salivating." The tone of voice she used told him that it was in jest, but he couldn't help but reply with a small smile. "Well, I won't say I haven't thought about it." Riaz blinked and her eyes swiveled up to his face. "Really? Then what are you dash?" Belle gulped before he muttered nervously, wondering if she was going to laugh at him. Well, it's just. It's the kind of thing a husband and wife do, right?" Though she hid it, Riaz did get a small blush on her face as she thought about it. A wedding dress, him in his suit, retreating to a suite for their wedding night. Waiting until marriage him? Well, I suppose I can wait that long. Though I don't know if Lily can. He gulped before asking nervously, remembering waking up with the girl in the hot springs in the morning. About that. How would we all? Sleep. Riaz replied helpfully, reaching over to grab his hand and ran her thumb over his knuckles. The primary wife shows is who sleeps in the bed each night, though it's uncommon for more than 3 to be in the bed at any night. If 2 sister wives love each other, then 4 to 5 can work. Depending on how large the harem becomes and how well curated the members are, there's also the possibility for a single, massive bed for everyone. Belle couldn't help but envisage himself, Riaz, Lily, Aquino, AIS. All right, time to stop that train of thought. He certainly could appreciate a girl, his grandfather had seen to that, but that didn't mean they would reciprocate his feelings. He said with a smile, beginning to loosen up. "Those hot springs on the 18th floor were great. I wish you could come with." She giggled before cooing. "Oh, thank you. I've heard in the East, they have natural hot springs all over the place. Maybe that should be our honeymoon destination." He nodded in agreement before asking curiously, "By the way, why didn't you get a bath beforehand?" She shrugged before replying morosely, "I use baths to think or relax, and if I'm constantly thinking, I can't relax. With my work, Riza, and what my future held, I had a bit too much to think about by the time I started the peerage with Aquino. This place was just supposed to be an office before Koneko joined, though I had some extra floors added in case we got more members." Belle frowned at the mention of Riza before promising her, "Well, if I can help lighten your workload at all, please ask. I don't like the idea of you not being able to relax." Riaz nodded into his neck before replying with a smile. "Say, when we have kids, do you have names in mind?" That was a bit out of left field, but Belle grinned nervously and replied, "Well, if it's a girl, I'd like. You. Ria's expectant expression didn't abate his nervousness as he muttered, "Iana." The redhead's eyes widened as she replied, apparently not on board with the name. "I don't think so. What girl wants the name of one of her father's conquests? But aside from that, why?" Belle wanted to glare at her for calling his advisor a conquest before explaining softly, Well, she always seems so dependable, and put together, and smart. I hope my children can be like that too." Ria's expression was unreadable until suddenly he felt her wrap her arms around him and mutter in frustration, "You're too goddamn adorable, you know that? Fine, our first girl's going to be called Aina. But if that's the inspiration, our first boy is going to be called Surzex. Got it?" They shared a look before they broke down in laughs at the absurdity of the situation. They eventually found themselves lying down, and Riaz asked curiously, "Say, you're still only 14, right?" Belle nodded, wondering where she was going with the train of thought. "What's your birthday?" He shrugged, much to her surprise. "Grandfather and I didn't celebrate birthdays, and I was too young to know it before my parents died. He always said that I should count the end of summer as my age. He always brought home a full deer for venison when the leaves began to turn." Riaz looked quite sad at that, but Belle helpfully continued, But I know yours, October 31st. Aquino's is December 1st, and Lily's is February 14th. He felt particularly proud at remembering the important dates, but was concerned when her expression didn't change. "Arias." She looked up and whispered morosely, "It just seems so unfair. Everybody should celebrate their birthday. It's important. It's when you join the world." "That's it, I've decided. Belle, your official birthday is now the 1st of September, a couple months from now." Belle's eyes widened as she seemed resolved in her choice. "W8, I don't need dash." Riaz silenced him with a small glare as she replied, "No, Belle, it's not okay. If I hear one complaint, then it's mutiny, and you know what I think about that." Her finger hooked under her bra, and Belle yelped as he closed his eyes, much to Riaz's amusement, before she let up on him. Their small talk continued, inanities and non sequiturs being traded until eventually they found themselves falling asleep. Eventually Lily walked into the room, the bag she'd been carrying now empty, as she went to update Riaz on the purchase. She paused as she saw the two laying bed together, snoozing away happily. She would be jealous if she hadn't joined them. Naza was right. Belle had to prefer a girl who knew what she wanted. When Belle awoke, it was to the best sleep he'd ever had. Chapter 14. Belle was surprised when he found himself standing next to Riaz where Aquino usually stood, but he soon found himself getting into the groove of his temporary role after a few hours. Aquino had decided to take a break from serving Riaz for a while, and had taught him how to brew tea as she did before showing him the necessary duties. While it was undoubtedly less interesting than the dungeon, he did enjoy the opportunity to spend more time with Riaz. She sighed as she finished off a page and passed it over to him, and Belle let it air for a second before setting it into a folder and closed it attentively. "Sorry, Belle, I know this is boring." He smiled down at her apologetic expression before replying with a smile. "It's fine, it's a punishment after all. Anyways, it's interesting to see what it's like for you and Aquino." She smiled gratefully before folding her hands on the desk. "My schedule for the rest of the day." Aquino had ensured that Belle knew the importance of memorizing the plan for the day without reading over the sheet. If he needed to read it, she had said, then he was just a middleman. "Just clearing the hallway and room for the Goibnu familiar tomorrow and sending off the measurements. I'll see to that. Miss Tuju is still out of the dungeon for now." She nodded and offered kindly, though Belle could see a look of desperation under her expression. "I don't mind helping." Belle dash. He cut her off with a small, heatless glare. He was starting to get a hang of this. "No, you need to relax. I'll be right back." Belle left the room and went to the kitchen, humming happily as he went about the task of making tea. If anything, he found the process quite calming as he retrieved some pastries and set them on a tray and walked back into the office, only to see a group of 6 performing some kind of bow in front of a shocked Riaz. He walked over and sat the tray down on the table, pouring the tea for Riaz in the manner he'd seen Aquino do so many times as Riaz asked incredulously, "Take a Mikazuchi?" "I don't recall demanding Dejiza." The person at the front kept his head down, though Belle could tell from what he could see of his face that he was a god. "Riaz Gremory, it has recently come to my attention that my familiar has committed a sin most dishonorable against your peerage." "Uka," the large man began, though he kept his head down. It was only then when Belle recognized their manner of dress vaguely. "A week ago, I made the decision to perform a pass parade for the good of my party. We have recently been tracked down the one member of the party we passed, a devil with white wings." Belle blinked in surprise as he recalled the incident. He'd largely forgotten about it. However, it seemed as if Riaz was less than pleased. "Take a Mikazuchi. Did I not give you a loan? Were my rates unreasonable? Did I not do this to ensure the safety of your children?" The god's face turned ashen as Riaz stood up, brimming with fury, until Belle put a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him with a surprised expression, though his smile managed to calm her down. She sat down, and Belle turned to them and said, "You can stand. One of you was injured, right? That can't be helping it." The familiar were surprised, but did so in practiced unison. Belle was shocked when he saw a startlingly pretty girl standing behind the god, but it was her eyes that made him really take note. He recognized them as the ones that had apologized to him as they ran past them. However, his eyes turned back to Takemikazuchi as he said gravely, "Young one, I am afraid you don't understand what has been done. My children were willing to endanger you, after your mistress had done so much for them. We must atone, our honor demands it." Bell gulped as he replied, waving his hands dismissively. Seriously, I managed to kill them, and Lily and Welf didn't get hurt. The middle floors can be dangerous, we all know that when we go down there." At that, the captain stepped forward and addressed Bell directly. "Exactly, we knew the risks, yet we failed to prepare ourselves properly. I do not regret my decision, but I am sorry." Riaz seemed ready to get angry again before Bell grinned back and held out his hand to the man, much to all their surprises. "While I can't speak for Lily, Welf or Riaz, but I accept your apology. I hope we can work together in the future." Uka took the hand and bowed lowly. "Truly, you are a man beyond his years. I graciously accept on behalf of the Takemikazuchi familia." The rest of the familia bowed along with him. Once they had finished, Riaz stood up, still looking irritated. "You should be glad Bell isn't asking for restitution, but that doesn't mean I won't." Takemikazuchi's expression fell as he replied dutifully, "We are prepared to pay whatever you deem fit." Bell was about to interrupt before Riaz's expression turned mischievous. "I don't want coin, I want a service. Bell and I will be attending the Apollo Familia Ball in 4 days, and while I am trained in dance and etiquette, I'd rather wait for the ball to dance with him. However, I can't exactly let him embarrass himself on the dance floor with no prior experience. Now, what am I to do?" His expression softened as he bowed in response. "The women of Takemikazuchi familia are at your disposal. However, I believe I can't instruct you in traditional devil dance." Riaz waved him off as she said with a satisfied nod, "I just need partners, and one that's a good fit for him. She'll be here by midday, and not freshly smelling of the dungeon. I'll ensure the same from Bell. She'll be fed and watered before she returns, but in return, I expect full compliance with my instruction." Uka nodded slowly before turning to Mikoto, who blinked in surprise. "Mikoto, are you willing?" She looked conflicted for a second, but with a look between the other girls in her familia and Bell, she nodded and said with a bow, "I will perform to the best of my abilities." Bell was busy looking at Riaz in surprise at the news as she said with a grin, "All right then, we'll consider this matter closed. Mikoto, I hope to see you here tomorrow. Oh, and Takemikazuchi." The man turned back to her and she smiled sweetly, though Bell could tell that there was a pitying mirth behind it. "I know you were disappointed not to see Akino. I'll give her your love." He yelped as the familia made their retreat, though Bell was surprised to see that Mikoto was starting at the god's back in pining. They left the house, and Riaz sighed sadly as she stared at the door, sipping from her teacup. "That poor girl," Bell asked nervously. What do you mean?" Riaz smiled up at him as she explained. "Takemikazuchi is an infamous womanizer. It's said 1,000 have loved him, but he has not reciprocated any of them. That girl pines for him not as her god or father, but as a lover, and she'll be sorely disappointed." Bell winced before he asked, "But I managed to. You know. Why can't she?" Riaz giggled at the omission as she replied, "First of all, extenuating circumstances, though I suspect IDVE fallen for you in any case. Secondly, us Gremory devils aren't the norm. We love freely. It's a core tenet of our blood. If love exists between two souls, it deserves to flourish. This isn't the case with many divines. Their love is twisted and odd. Take Freya, for instance. She loves every single one of her children like dolls in a dollhouse. They love her in return, but there is always a barrier between them, playthings and the player. Takemikazuchi isn't capable of anything other than familial love for you children. It is a sad situation for the girl, watching as he slips away without any chance to claim his heart." He frowned, wondering how that must feel like. They set about the rest of their day as Bell got to work, cleaning out a large room on the 3rd floor for the new bathroom. Bell hadn't gone up to the 3rd floor before, or the 4th for that matter, but Riaz had said that it was mostly empty rooms for storage or expansion. Riaz went out for the rest of the day, telling him that she intended to spend the day with Koneko. Eventually he was done, and Akino and Lily returned. Riaz eventually returned as well with Koneko in tow, though the girl retired to her room without a word to the others. Lily took a seat with a small smile to Bell as Akino reported. The guild knows about Bell's level up and the reports were handed in without issues. "Bell, Aina sends her congratulations, though she did tell me to inform you that a lecture was on your way." Bell gulped nervously as Riaz giggled at the threat. "That's good to hear, Send her an open invitation for dinner. Lily, anything to report? She sat up and replied. I've spoken with Welf and dropped off the black Goliath hide with him. He sends his thanks and that he's glad you're okay, Master Bell. Otherwise, the Goibnu familiar has sourced their materials and predicts they will be able to finish their work before sundown tomorrow. Riaz nodded before leaning back with a satisfied smile. They ate, and Bell briefly wondered about the closed door with a single white cat's paw on the door, but pushed it out of his mind. After all, he was beginning dance training the next day. Joy. The next day the sound of construction could be heard underneath the floorboards as Bell stood ramrod straight in front of one Mikoto Yamato. She had donned a robe more suited for dancing, and Riaz was standing with Akino, who was sitting at a grand piano. The room they were in was large enough for their purposes, but it was sparse, and not a little dusty despite their best efforts. Riaz clapped her hands together to get their attention before beginning excitedly. Now then, let's start, shall we? Bell, step forward and set your right hand below her left arm. Mikoto will reciprocate with her right hand on your shoulder. He gulped before stepping forward and nervously placing his hand in the dedicated place. Mikoto didn't seem too embarrassed, or even perturbed whatsoever as her hand gently clasped his shoulder. Riaz continued, clearly enjoying the distress on Bell's face. All right, now extend your free hands out and clasp them. That's it, a little higher. Now in the required position, Bell's wings began to flutter nervously before Riaz called out. Keep your wings tucked in. If you don't, you can unbalance both of you. Only experienced pairs are expected to use their wings, usually to flourish. Bell nodded and forced the limbs back into their folded state on his back. Akino began to play a slow waltz as Riaz began calling out instructions. Now, step in time with the music. Let's just start with moving as a pair. They began to walk around in circles, and Bell was trying his best to look in any other direction than Mikoto as the girl silently did her duty. Eventually the music cut out when Riaz sighed and shook her head, motioning for her queen to stop. That won't do. Both of you are too stiff. Bell, Mikoto, I want you two to hold a conversation this time, no breaking eye contact. He gaped at her in surprise as the music began and had to stumble to keep up with Mikoto for a second before they fell back into step. So, she was looking at him blankly, though Bell wasn't sure if she was interested in starting the conversation. After a few seconds, he bucked up what courage he had before asking. Adventuring. Riaz looked at him like he was a lost cause before Mikoto blinked and replied. What of it? Bell gulped and continued. How do you find it? What's your level? How do you fight? Your form makes me think. Front line. Mikoto's eyes widened before she loosened up, and Riaz could see that she was significantly less stiff as she replied. I'm level 2, and you're correct, I'm a part of the front line. Yourself. He nodded, glad that his icebreaker had worked to an extent as he replied happily. I became level 3 recently, though I've not been down in the dungeon since. I'm a part of a 3-person cell, and I guess I use my magic as much as I use my knife. They continued talking about their combat styles as Akino and Riaz exchanged amused expressions. Eventually Riaz clapped her hands, and the two stopped as she began with a pleased nod. That was a good start. Now let's begin with the basic waltz. Let's start with the pattern. She led them through the required steps, and even though their inexperience was obvious, their experience in the dungeon helped them not step on each other's toes. Eventually Riaz called them to stop and nodded in satisfaction as Akino massaged her exhausted fingers. That was a good start, you two. We'll do some different routines tomorrow. Now then, if the silence is anything to go by. As if by magic, Lily walked inside and reported excitedly. Construction's done and the Goibnu familiars left, baths ready. Mikoto's expression looked as hungry as Bell felt and Riaz cheered excitedly. All right, come on girls, we've got a bath to break in. Akino made for the door as did Riaz, though she turned back in confusion as Mikoto looked somewhere between resigned and envious. Well, you coming, Mikoto? She looked surprised as Riaz snickered and explained. The more the merrier, eh? Bell, you can use the shower in. Screw it, you did well, be back before midnight. Bell grinned thankfully as he made for the shower as Mikoto nervously followed the 3 devils down the stairs and into a large bathroom. They cleaned themselves off in the provided showers before they found themselves sinking into the waters, and Mikoto couldn't help but sigh in relief when she felt the warm water on her skin. Riaz giggled from where she'd been sitting as she asked, You look like you needed this. What is Take Mikazuchi doing to you guys? She sighed and replied, leaning back up against the wall as Lily happily swam through the waters. Most of our funds go straight back to the shrine. I don't begrudge my place. The woman frowned and replied, a little uncomfortable with the resigned expression on her face. It was eerily similar to the expression she'd seen on herself for many years. Here's the worst, a girl has needs. Mikoto looked like she wanted to refute her, but the protest died in her throat when she looked around the room. How did you afford this anyways? Lily grinned as she replied, still floating around in the water with a blissful expression on her face. Master Bell and I used the funds from killing a Goliath to pay for it. You really know how to invest Rias, she giggled and replied happily. Bell would have just spent it on potions or equipment, need to help him relax sometimes. Though I do wonder if he's heard of the Pleasure Quarter before. Granted, I can't see him going there of his own volition. Akino's expression darkened as she replied. He'd better not before I've had a taste of him at least. Lily. The supporter reported with a shrug. Welf told him about it, said he'd take him there at some point. Don't worry, I think he'll wait until the night before your wedding at least. Rias groaned as she recounted in despair. They'd better not. The last time Surzex went there it nearly caused a religious war with the Ishtar familia. Grafia had him sleeping in the garden for a month. I'd rather not have to punish Bell like that. I've gotten quite accustomed to him being in my bed. Lily, you'd keep me company, right? The two shared a grin as they remembered Bell's reaction to waking up between the two girls. Of course, though I can think of some more creative punishments. How about forcing him to sleep in Akino's room for a week? Mikoto was shocked by the openness they were displaying, and in front of a stranger no less. Taika Mikazuchi had warned her that the Gremory devils were more amorous than before, but after seeing Bell's innocent worry about Chigusa's injury, she'd not expected this. Wait. Arus seriously dash she was cut off as Rias replied with a grin. What? He's the only guy in the peerage. What's wrong with a little fun? The only human in the bath looked to the side nervously as she replied incredulously. That's, surely. He is a child. How can you dash? She was suddenly met with 3 pairs of indignant eyes, and Lily was about to shout something before Rias explained. It's fine this time, but please, he is not a child. He's immature and naive, but not a child. In any case, he has won my hand and has proven himself a suitable husband and has the capacity to become a high-class devil. Mikoto nodded, suitably chastised before Lily continued, perhaps a bit more vindictive than she meant. Anyways, Master Bell managed to take out that pass parade by himself. He's much stronger than a normal adventurer. Not to mention, he's a better man than the other adventurers that I've met. Master Bell could hold me down and ravish me, and I wouldn't say a dash. She was suddenly cut off by Rias slapping a hand on her mouth with an apologetic smile as Mikoto began to burn up. Perhaps we should tone it down, Lily? Though I don't disagree. The hand was removed as Lily sighed in defeat, splashing slightly as she stopped floating and sat down. Fine. Wonder what he's getting up to. By the way, congratulations. Your punishment lasted all of 2 days. With Bell the boys I twitched as Syr put down another plate in front of him while Mamma Mia roared happily. To becoming level 3. Who'd ve imagined, that little devil walking in here nervously a few months ago now a second-class adventurer. Bell smiled gratefully though he knew he was going to have a hefty bill. Granted, he was hungry after half a day of dancing, but he'd be eating into his savings until he was able to go back down into the dungeons. Syr sat down across from him and gave him a big smile, and he had to admit, she was just as pretty as when he'd met her for the first time. He had noticed that he was starting to get a bit more confident, but even still, he couldn't bring himself to mention the last time they'd met. Sue, level 3 here? I bet your mistress is jumping for joy. He wasn't sure about the look in her eyes, but he scratched the back of his head as he replied with a sigh. Not really, I'm getting punished for a week. Syr's eyes swam with mirth as he explained. I am not allowed into the dungeons, and the only reason I'm here is because all of the girls are busy with the new bath and I'd burn the house down with the stove. And I have to do dance training. Rias wants me to accompany her to a ball on Friday. The waitress blinked in surprise before asking curiously. The Apollo Familia ball. Interesting. Also, why are you getting punished? Bell cleared his throat, blushing slightly as he explained. I have a curfew, as she doesn't like it if I'm out too late. There was a long moment before Syr laughed at the idea as Bell hid his embarrassment in his mug. Ah really? Man, I don't know how you live like that. A curfew, while being level 3. He didn't disagree that it seemed excessive, but he knew that it was coming from a place of worry. Syr continued, a little suggestively as she asked. Say, If I was your mistress, would you obey my commands like that? Belle gulped in fear, wondering what the right answer was before suddenly a voice cut in. SYR, loyalty like that is earned, not given. They both looked up to see Liu looking down at the waitress as SYR pouted. Oh, come on Liu, isn't it a nice idea? A guy like Belle at your beck and call at all hours of the day, him welcoming you home in nothing but an apron. The elf's face lit up before she made her retreat as SYR snickered at Belle's shocked reaction. She's been embarrassed around the topic of you ever since you grabbed her hands before you made your daring rescue. Elves are really self-conscious around skinship, you know. They only allow it with people they truly trust. A bit forward to grab the hands of a waitress you barely know. Some might consider it a declaration of intent. Belle's mind stopped as he remembered the incident vividly, and more recently, offering his hand to Lefia. Shaking himself out of it, he stood up and said in a panic, I need to go and apologize. SYR waved him back down into his seat as she replied. She'll be busy in the kitchens. Wait until we clear out. In the meantime, Mamma Mia. Belle wants another ale. After an hour of drinking, the tavern cleared out and SYR motioned Belle into the kitchens with an encouraging grin. Go ahead, I'll go and get your bill ready. Belle gulped before standing up and making his way over to the kitchens. Stepping inside, he saw the elf in question standing at the sinks, washing dishes until she caught sight of him. The others, Anya and Chloe, noticed his appearance and giggled before taking their leave. Hey Cranel. Nayo made a lot of dishes tonight. Help Liu with them, okay? He was shocked at the sudden duty before we nodded, walking over and standing next to the elf who adamantly refused to make eye contact with him. It felt like the beginning of his dance training all over again, but this time, he didn't hesitate to speak up. Liu. She nearly dropped a fork into the sink as she replied. Why yes, Mr. Cranel. He gulped before replying apologetically. I just learned from SYRT that elves aren't good with skin contact. And. I am sorry, about then. Liu stalled for a few seconds, her expression returning to a neutral as she continued to wash dishes. It's not an issue. I must say, it surprised me, but I don't begrudge you for it. Belle's questioning expression prompted her to continue, even as she looked to the side in embarrassment. You went up against odds not feasibly surmountable for the sake of your mistress. That was beautiful and nostalgic. It was then when I realized that you were a man I could trust to touch my skin, though I admit, I have been less than sure about how to broach the subject. Tell me, why did you do such a thing for her? It seemed like you were still the boy who ran away from Loki Familiar's taunting, but then you summoned the courage to face down a high-class devil. He was flattered, but that question wasn't one he could answer easily. That bell seemed so long ago, before he'd met Lily, before he could stand on his own 2 feet. Eventually he replied in a soft voice, unaware to the silver-haired waitress listening from behind the door. I couldn't let her go, no matter how scared I was. She's my mistress, the woman who fed and watered me, who picked me up where my grandfather left me. And even though I'm a little young, and she's a lot to handle, I don't regret becoming her suitor. Liu blinked in surprise before frowning. I was under the impression that SYR was to be your partner. Belle felt a sweat forming on the back of his neck as he explained. Well, I wouldn't. This is hard to say. It wouldn't be a problem. Her unimpressed look didn't give him much hope as he tried to salvage the conversation. D-devils can have multiple partners, and well. Yeah. Liu's face lit up in red as she said, simultaneously disgusted and fascinated. Surely that can only lead to conflict. How can you, as a man, dedicate yourself to multiple women? Belle's hands stopped washing the dishes as he thought about the answer. It was something he'd been worried about. If the situation did come to pass, how would he handle it? Eventually he realized that his answer was rather simple, and he began washing the dishes again with a small smile. I don't know, but I'll try. Riaz, Lily, Eve and SYR. If they'll have me, I'll love them all to the best of my ability. There was a long pause before the elf spoke up again. As I cannot imagine being in a harem like that. However, if I had to entrust SYR to any man who desired such a thing, it would be you. Never hurt her. Belle. They continued to wash the dishes in a comfortable silence as SYR listened from behind the door, pondering his words quietly. Love us all to the best of his ability. Him. Chapter 15. A carriage rumbled to a halt as Belle stepped out first, offering his arm to Riaz as the girl stepped down after him daintily. They were just outside of a large, opulent hall rented for the occasion, and Belle felt a bit like he had on his first date with Riaz, namely equal parts excited and terrified. The girl in question was in a similar dress to that night, but it was a little bit more conservative, covering her shoulders and incorporating a touch of white. Nonetheless, she looked stunning, and it had taken Belle a good few minutes to speak properly when he'd first seen her. Taking his arm, Riaz noted with a small smile. It seems as if the Apollo Familia is going all out this year. Now, where are they? Belle blinked curiously, wondering who she was talking about before another carriage rolled up next to them. The door opened, and Belle was surprised to see both Mayak and Takemikazuchi step out, followed by Naza and Mikoto. He hadn't expected them to be here, or rather, he hadn't been told that they'd be attending. He gave the four a smile as Riaz began warmly. I'm glad to see you four could make it. Mayak, Takemikazuchi, dashing as ever. They were in well-made, if plain, suits. Takemikazuchi bowed as he responded. It was certainly a surprise, but I thank you for sponsoring our attendance, Miss Gremory. Riaz waved him off as she replied, giving a small wink to Mikoto. Of course, I have grown fond of Mikoto this past week, and it would be nice to see one of my students make use of her newfound talents. Mayak spoke up then, and Belle noted that neither of the men had taken the arms of their companions. Wasn't it expected of them? While I am grateful, I must admit I didn't expect your generous donation, Miss Gremory. She nodded before explaining with a calm expression, one she commonly used when she was implying a favor. You have been good to my Belle and Lily. Consider this an invitation to additional dealings, shall we say? We can discuss this later, shall we? The party made their way inside, and Belle was surprised by the number in attendance. It was full of gods, goddesses, and even a few devils, judging by the faint scent of demonic power in the air. Belle's eyes were drawn to a familiar red-headed man standing with a blonde man in a feathered cap. Riaz noticed his gaze and asked approvingly, Shall we go over and say hello? There will be a while before the dancing starts. Belle nodded and they bade farewell to the others, still noticing that Takemikazuchi still refused to take Mikoto's arm. They made their way over, and Riaz called out warmly, Brother, Hermes, it has been a while. Surzex turned with a surprised blink only to smile happily when he caught sight of them. If it isn't the happy couple. Riaz, as beautiful as I, as to be expected. Belle, that suit is quite dashing if I do say so myself. I trust you know Hermes here. The god in question tipped his hat to them, though he addressed Belle first as his captain stood to the side with a cautious gaze at the interaction. Ah, Belle Cranel, indeed it has been a while. Imagine my shock when I watched you go and pull that stunt after meeting with me at Babel. What a rush. Belle laughed nervously as Riaz replied with an underlying threat in her voice. Hermes, perhaps not the most polite opener I've heard, but certainly it was a memorable night. Is that you, Andromeda? You look lovely tonight. Asfi nodded her thanks silently before Riaz asked curiously, Is Graphia not here? Surzex shrugged and replied, She'll be around. Apparently she wanted to scout the grounds. Anyways, I was sure the Citri were to attend tonight. You've not met with Sona since you went to Gokai, have you? At that Riaz perked up happily. Really? I'll be sure to keep my eyes out for her then. They continued to make small talk for a while as Belle kept his eyes out over the party. It wasn't intentional, but he felt as if he should be keeping his eyes out, just in case. Eventually Apollo made his welcoming speech, but Belle noticed something out of the corner of his eyes. Turning, he noticed that Riaz's champagne was fizzing a little faster than before, and he thought he saw a small speck of white in it before it dissolved into bubbles. That can TVE be normal. Riaz went to pick up her flute again, and Belle suddenly felt a fear grip his heart as his paranoia took over. Taking the glass before she could, he took a gulp of it only to feel something terrible come over him. Falling to one knee, the rest of the party turned in shock as Belle coughed horribly. Riaz knelt down and asked fearfully, Belle, what's going on? What's wrong? He gritted his teeth, now extremely grateful for the developmental skill abnormal resistance as he set the drink on the table and got to his feet. It was spiked. I knew it. A gasp rippled through the hall as Belle allowed the feeling of vertigo to pass. Dizziness, and it felt like I needed to puke for a second. Riaz, are you okay? She looked ready to commit murder before Surzex called out angrily towards Apollo. Apollo, what is the meaning of this? The god in question looked ready to murder as he walked over, arrogantly scoffing. Spiked. Preposterous. I would never. Apollo took the flute and sipped from it, only to turn green as he fell to the ground. Belle looked around, wondering who could have done it, but the only people close enough would be Hermes or Asfi, and they looked as surprised as the rest of the party. He faintly spotted Loki in the distance with, "Oh no, was that AIS?" But they were way too far away to spike the drink. Eventually Apollo got to his feet as he was handed a potion, and he wiped his mouth as Surzek's expression didn't change. It was like when Riaz was angry, but Bel felt like an oppressive weight had covered him as Surzek glowered down at the god. "Apollo, if my sister had drunk that concoction, who knows what might have happened?" The god looked particularly pale as Surzek crossed his arms and said formally, "There will be a formal investigation into this, let me assure you. Though I would caution you to curate your guests better next time. I would also recommend that the drinks are tested." There was a loud muttering as all of the bottles were tested, but it seemed as if none of the other drinks had been spiked. Eventually the party got underway again, and Bel felt a small hand on his shoulder and turned to see Riaz looked at him in worry. "Do you want to call it a night?" "I don't need to dance." She was cut off as Bel took her hand and said, assuring her, "I am fine, Riaz, honestly. And I wouldn't be lying if I said I wanted to dance with you as well. So, let's just try to have a nice time." The music began as he took her hand, leading her towards the dance floor. He had a duty to make sure that she enjoyed her night. It was a man's duty to satisfy his woman, as his grandfather would say. Setting themselves into a soft waltz, Riaz sighed and rested her chin on his shoulder as they danced. "You really are a dummy. There would be other opportunities to dance, you know. By dancing, it's like saying that Apollo is forgiven, and I can't say I have. What if you had still been level 2? What if that poison had been stronger than it had been?" Bel nudged her with his chin, acutely aware of the stares of the party around them as they twirled around the floor. It was a far cry from dancing with Mikoto, but he wouldn't say it was any worse. Riaz had a practiced ease around her, and he began to wonder how growing up in high society really was. What if you had drunk it? "I am supposed to protect you. I don't regret keeping you safe. As for other opportunities, well, they'd be ages away, and tonight was supposed to be special." Riaz giggled as she replied, "You're a hopeless romantic, or rather, you're hopelessly romantic. Fine, but I get to nurse you back to health if you fall sick. I'm sure you'd prefer my tender mercies to a sanatorium." They continued to dance for a while, enjoying the feeling before they separated, and Riaz said mischievously, "You know, we're supposed to change partners. I'll go and see if my brother is free. He's quite a good dancer after all." She walked off, and Bel was shocked when he heard a voice behind him. "Oh my, I don't suppose I could have this dance then, him." He turned around to see, of all people, Freya looking down at him with a mysterious smile. The boar man he recognized from the Lumiere was standing a few paces behind her, and Bel realized that all eyes were on them. Suppressing his nerves, he extended his hand and replied confidently, much to the rest of the party's shocked gasps. "I'd be honored." Freya giggled as she took his hand, and Bel realized that she was about half a head taller than them as they began to twirl around the dance floor. He had to admit, she was an amazing dancer, and it took all he had to keep up with her while maintaining eye contact. Something about her seemed familiar, tempting and mischievous all at the same time as Freya spoke first. My, you are quite the accomplished young gentleman, Bel. Enduring a poison for your mistress and then continuing to dance, and with a rival goddess at that." Bel kept any emotion from his face as he responded evenly. "I'd keep her safe, even if it took my life. And it's not as if I could refuse your offer, Lady Freya. It would only cause problems for my mistress." She raised an eyebrow before replying with a smile. "I'm flattered. I do apologize for my conduct then. I'm afraid Riaz has yet to forgive me. Can I count on you for that?" He gulped before replying, nearly stumbling over his feet. "I can't speak for Riaz, but it was still a special night. I'd prefer not to ruin another one." Freya nodded and replied with a nod as the music came to a close. "Of course, you shan't have any trouble from myself tonight. Thank you for the dance. I hope we can have another someday." Bel nodded as he made a retreat from the floor, walking over to where Riaz was watching him uneasily. Almost immediately she took his arm as she asked worriedly, "What did she want? Did she ask you for anything?" He smiled at her concern as he reported proudly, "As she won't be giving us any trouble tonight, on the condition I danced with her in the future." Riaz sighed and gave him a pout. "That wasn't necessary, but still, thank you. Though I'm a little jealous, you two were the center of attention. Like you and her fit together better." As she trailed off, Bel's arm tensed, and he said softly, "Riaz, can we go to the balcony for a second?" The girl was lead over there, surprised by the initiative he was showing. Once they were out of the eyes of the rest of the party, Bel threw his arms around her and whispered angrily, "Don't say that." She was shocked by his tone of voice as she whispered, Wait, what did I say? Belle stepped back, and Riaz was surprised to see an embarrassed pout on his face. That I looked better with. You're my fiancé, not her. I'd choose you over a million Freyas any day of the week, okay? So don't say stuff like that. How would you like it if I said you looked better with Takemikazuchi, or Mayak, or Aakino? She understood where he was coming from. It was the same insecurities she'd been trying to stamp out in him. Giggling, she threw her arms around him in turn and planted a kiss on his cheek. Okay, sorry, Belle. Oh, and I'd say I'd look best with Aakino. I learned to dance with her when I was 12 after all. Belle laughed at the image as they returned to the ballroom, and he was surprised to see Loki approaching them with AIS in tow. The goddess of mischief stopped in front of them and said brusquely, Hey, RI, give me a second with your boy, all right? Riaz gripped his hand as she responded with a disbelieving voice. If you have anything to say to him, you can say it to me as well, Loki. The goddess groaned before turning to leave. Fine, we're going our dash. The girl in question tilted her head before speaking up curiously. I thought you wanted to thank Belle for saving the expedition. Loki gaped at the girl in shock as Riaz giggled in vindictive glee. Oh, I didn't think you would, render me impressed, Loki. There is a heart behind that washboard. A small crowd was beginning to form around them as Belle said disapprovingly, Riaz, that's not very fair. The crowd turned to him in shock as Riaz asked with a disbelieving expression, You're defending her? That's polite, even for you, Belle. Remember, she called you a cheater. Belle gulped before remembering that even Aakino had disobeyed Riaz when it needed to be done. And no, it's not that. I don't like her much either. But calling her AAA washboard isn't fair. Suddenly Loki crossed her arms with a victorious grin on her face. Looks like he can appreciate a good body when he sees one. Never thought I'd see a Gremory devil with taste. Riaz looked over at her with a deadpan expression before replying. Don't try your luck, Loki. He's only saying that because he's young and pent up. Belle, love, you can do much better than her. Belle gaped in surprise at her accusation and was about to refute her before Loki replied challengingly. Fine then. If that's how it is, then I say we have a little contest. I dance with him, and you dance with my AIS. Whoever dances the best is the better choice. AIS tilted her head and said morosely. But I wanted to dance with Belle Dash. She was suddenly pulled away by a fuming Riaz as the girl whispered promisingly. If you help me win this, I'll let you dance with Belle after this. Aoi's gained an edge of competitiveness in her expression as the two teams took their positions. Apollo looked extremely relieved at the friendly competition, wiping away the mutters about the spiked drink as he said with a grin, I believe I shall officiate. Band. The music began, and Belle began to waltz with Loki as the goddess grinned up at him with a promising expression. Hey, how about you and I bust this joint and find a tavern open this late? Promise, I'll make it worth your while, tomato devil. Belle's hand tightened and Loki let out a small yelp as he replied, looking down at her with a disapproving stare. Please don't use that name, Lady Loki. Loki looked up at her partner as he looked at her the same way he'd looked at Riaz when he'd chided her and suddenly felt a thud in her chest as she inspected every line on his face. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her with that title, and one who didn't make fun of her for her chest at that. Oh, what should I call you then? He replied, and Loki couldn't help but salivate at how manly his voice sounded in her own little rose-tinted world. Belle, just Belle. She internally squealed as the pace picked up, and they began to twirl around wildly to the cheers of the crowd. Belle couldn't see Riaz and AIS, but he didn't look. He was taking charge of the dance, increasing the tempo with ever more complex steps that didn't make any sense to Loki as she was brought along for the ride, lost in her own little world as she was swept away. Eventually the music stopped on a grand crescendo, and Belle dipped Loki so close to the floor that she could feel her hair touch the cool marble. His lips were so close to hers, so full and inviting. She craned her neck to make the contact she so desperately wanted, only for Belle to stand up, helping her up with a nervous smile. Thank you for the dance, Lady Loki. It was only then when Apollo called out excitedly. Well, I don't think there's any contest. A partner who can make even Loki seem feminine is a prodigy in the making. Loki was still stunned by the explosive dance and couldn't say anything as Riaz and AIS walked over, both girls pouting unhappily. Belle, how am I supposed to show up Loki if you do something like that? Where did you learn that anyways? Belle shrugged, laughing nervously as he replied. Well, I kinda just followed the rhythm. It was like fighting in the dungeon. There's kinda this flow. Suddenly he asked excitedly, can we dance again? This is really fun. Riaz couldn't help but blush at his hopeful expression and fanned her face slightly. Well, I'm a little tired right now. Maybe you could take over for this one AIS. The sword princess in question blinked in surprise before Belle offered her his hand excitedly. And may I have this dance? She took his hand in surprise as the music started up again, and she suddenly found herself swept away just like her goddess had been. This was nowhere near the shy boy she'd trained all those weeks ago. It was like he was a different person. He had a massive grin on his face as they twirled around the dance floor. This is the first night I've danced. Belle blinked in surprise before asking, calming down the dance for a bit as he asked. Really? Riaz gave me training for the week. Did you like it? AIS gave him a small smile as she replied. Yes. It's thrilling. Can we go faster? They shared a look before Belle gave her an excited smile. The combined speed of two adventurers suddenly became more in sync as AIS became more proactive in the dance, and the rest of the gods seemed to feel like they didn't measure up as their partners stared over at the two enviously. Both Belle and AIS had massive smiles on their face, and even Riaz and Loki weren't at each other's throats as they stared at the pair slack-jawed. Eventually they turned a rapid twirl into a dip as the music ended, and Belle's wings unconsciously flared out much to the crowd's delight. Belle was gasping for breath, though his smile was still plastered on his face. AIS was in a much better position, a contented expression on her face as she held him closely. Eventually they stood up, and Belle bowed to her as AIS curtsied like she'd seen a few other women do after their dances. That was fun, thank you, Belle. He scratched his cheek as he responded. Anytime, thank you, AIS. What they didn't see was Mikoto staring out at the couple with a longing look. Why couldn't Takumi Kazuchi look at her like that? He'd even left to go and dance with some other goddesses, and hadn't even asked her to dance once. Suddenly she felt a hand pat her back and turned to see Riaz smiling down at her encouragingly. You know, there's always space on Belle's arm for you. He is the hottest commodity tonight, it seems. Indeed, Belle was trying to address a group of clambering goddesses as they tried to demand a dance from him. Mikoto sighed as she responded longingly. Lord Takumi Kazuchi hasn't asked me to dance yet. It would be improper. Riaz steeled herself before offering, allowing a small amount of devilish influence to shine in her eye. I heard from my sister-in-law that the easiest way to get a man's attention as a woman is to dance with another man. If he gets jealous, then that's your in. If he doesn't, then it's a lost cause. I'm willing to lend you Belle for testing purposes. Mikoto's eyes widened as she hugged herself, looking down at the dress she had been gifted with a conflicted expression. I am. But what if he doesn't get jealous, Miss Gremory? What do I do then? Riaz smiled encouragingly as she replied. Then he's an idiot who doesn't know what's in front of him, and maybe he'll realize what he's lost when you find a man who can appreciate you. Go on, trust me on this. However, if you do this, then be ready to accept any outcome. The girl deliberated for a few seconds before nodding determinedly. Thank you, I'll get my answer tonight. Mikoto stormed off towards Belle, carving a path in the crowd of women as Riaz watched her go with a smile. Suddenly a voice spoke up behind her. Grafia never told you that, did she? You're terrible, Riaz. She turned with a soft smile as her childhood friend, Sona, walked up next to her. She was undoubtedly shorter than she was, about as tall as Belle had been before he became a devil, but had a serious look about her and glasses that screamed cool authority. No, but she's never going to be happy otherwise. Best stop her from fantasizing now than later, when it's had time to fester. Sona sighed and replied warningly. It is not your place to save her. Riaz replied, resolute in her decision. If not my place, then who would? There are two outcomes. She walks away tonight having done the impossible, or she walks away with the friends she needs to bounce back. Besides, she and Belle look quite cute together, don't they? Indeed, the two shone particularly bright on the dance floor as Mikoto led them through the steps instead of Belle. She seemed determined to give Belle the best damn dance of his life, and even from afar they could see he looked entranced by the girl. Sona gave her a small smile as she replied in exasperation. You Gremory devils are incorrigible. It's good to see you, Riaz. Riaz giggled and replied in turn, keeping an eye on her champagne flute. You too, Sona. It's been quite the roller coaster. They stayed quiet, just watching the dancing for a minute before Sona spoke up. Word is that the poisoning was a power play from the Apollo Familiar, and the antidote had been prepared in advance. What do you plan on doing? Riaz gripped her flute's stem as she replied measuredly. Brother will handle the investigation. If it turns out to be truly on them, I will call for war. Sona shuddered, crossing her arms as she replied warningly. That may not be so simple. If the perpetrator turns out to be a high-level familiar, or a peerage for that matter, then you may need to call for your family's aid. If that happens, you lose your reputation. If you let the matter slide, you lose your reputation. The redhead laughed as Mikoto took Belle for a spin, reversing the roles much to the delight of the crowd even though Belle looked somewhere between flustered and excited. Oh Sona, you don't seem to understand. They tried to take me out with poison, a coward's weapon. They consider me enough of a threat to use it, and as such, they must be within beatable strength. Sona nodded before replying, still worried for her friend. In any case, please, ask for my help if you need it. My peerage has resources you might well need. Riaz thanked her as the dance came to a close and began to watch Mikoto and Takumi Kazuchi closely. The girl was looking at her god expectantly, but the man was just applauding politely, Demeter on his arm. Mikoto's expression soured and she began to stomp away angrily with tears welling in her eyes, and Belle looked between the two in horror before Takumi Kazuchi walked over and asked worriedly, "What's wrong? Is she upset?" Belle felt a well of frustration for the girl bubble up in his heart as he bit back. For a divine being, you can be very blind, Lord Takumi Kazuchi. If you'll excuse me. He rushed off after the girl and Riaz sighed sadly, beginning to feel a well of guilt in her heart bubble. She didn't regret what she'd done, it needed to be revealed to the girl, but seeing the young maiden she'd come to see as a friend cry wasn't pleasant. Sona asked curiously, "Will you go to her?" Riaz shook her head, replying softly, "No, Belle is her equal, it will be easier for him to connect with her. I just hope she's not too harsh with him." With Belle he gasped as he found himself in the garden of the venue, searching around for Mikoto. While he was exhausted from the dancing, he knew that whatever she was feeling couldn't wait. Eventually Belle caught sight of the purple dress she'd been wearing, sitting against a tree while soft sobs emanated from the figure. Summoning his strength, he walked over and sat down next to her, not speaking immediately. Mikoto didn't look up from where she'd buried her face in her knees as she whispered harshly, "What do you want?" Belle gulped before replying, "I just wanted to check on you." "He's an ass." Mikoto shifted her head, allowing one purple eye to look up at him through a haze of tears. "You. No. Know about my crush." Belle shook his head, replying sadly as he felt a few tears in his own eyes. "No, that was love. I can't place it, but the way you looked at him was more than a crush." The girl laughed hollowly as she replied, "Love, crush, doesn't do me much good now. It's over, isn't it?" He shrugged, pulling his own knees up as he replied, letting his wings stretch out gratefully. "Is it?" Mikoto replied with a sigh, kicking a rock away as she replied sadly, "Even after that, he won't look at me as anything other than his little girl. I tried my best to look as much as a woman as possible. I've matured, did his bidding to the best of my abilities. Did I tell you that I asked him on a date once? He thought it was a prank cooked up by everyone else. Say, Belle, what would you do?" He was silent for a long, pondering her situation. When he finally spoke, it was with sympathy. "He loves you, but if he doesn't love you romantically, you can't change that. He's not the type to abandon you or hurt you intentionally. You can always rely on him, but he won't look at you like a lover." She choked out a question, begging for an answer. "So what now? What do I do now?" Belle winced before he spoke up sadly, knowing that nothing he said would ease the pain. "It's not the last page of your story, Mikoto. There's a happy ending somewhere. Someone's going to realize how talented and pretty you are, and you'll think that person is kind of nice, and it'll be a new chapter." There was a long, sad silence as Mikoto sobbed lightly. Eventually she choked out, "Why you think I'm talented and pretty?" He laughed, a small blush on his face as he replied, "Well, I've only danced with you, so I don't know how strong you are, but I definitely think you're an incredible dancer." Mikoto unwound and sighed, leaning her head against the bark of the tree and whispered apologetically, "I've ruined our dance, and your night. I'm sorry, Belle." Belle nudged her in the side, replying with a warm grin, "What are friends for? And, I wouldn't consider the dance ruined. You were incredible." She smiled ruefully at the boy's enthusiasm before wiping her eyes and asking, "Belle, if I ever, gods, I can't get the words out, ran away, from my familiar, from adventuring, would you follow me?" Belle nodded his head, surprising Mikoto. She didn't take him as one to lie, and seeing his conviction was inspiring. "I'd follow you and bring you home, and you could do whatever you wanted for the rest of your life. You could cut wood, sing, or become a farmer, and you'd still be my friend Mikoto. If you were sick, I'd buy medicine. If you were rejected, I'd be there as long as you'd have me. We're friends." Her voice caught in her throat as she stared at the boy she'd called a child only 4 days ago. Now she could see exactly where she'd been wrong. Standing up, she offered her his hand with a teary grin. If I may then, can I have this dance?" That one didn't count. That wasn't about partnership. You deserve better than that. Friend." He was surprised but took her hand nonetheless. Pulling himself to his feet, they fell into a few gentle steps, her dress flowing around them as they enjoyed the sound of distant music. Neither of them realized they were being watched from the balcony by Hermes and Asfi, and the god grinned as he asked her under his breath. "So then, dear Asfi, what is the next act for our dashing hero? His dear mistress has suffered an assassination attempt in a god's banquet. What is to come?" Asfi gritted her teeth as she replied, "Lord Hermes, this is madness." He laughed as he replied, a decidedly mad glint in his eye. "There is no madness in improvisation, dear Asfi, merely a story being woven before the actors. Now, what is next?" She sighed and reported, "Apollo's interest in the boy has just skyrocketed. If necessary, we can push both parties towards a war game. The devils can consider it the settling of a specific grudge, and the divines welcome any form of entertainment." Hermes smiled as he looked down at the dancing couple, the rim of his hat falling over his eyes as he said with a grin, "Well then, I suppose I shall count myself among the ranks of the divines tonight. Show me a good performance, Bell." And so did the boy dance under the moonlight, unawares as to the plotting of the god above. Chapter 16. Bell hopped down into the 18th floor as he was followed by both Welf and Lily. After his punishment had ended a few days ago, he'd been eager to begin adventuring again with his new level 3 stats, and the difference had been staggering. Welf hefted his greatsword onto his back as he whistled at the large crystal structure in the roof of the floor. "Whoa, don't see that every day. So, lunch break." Lily nodded and took a seat, pulling off her backpack as Bell plopped down with a sigh of relief. "It's about time for lunch, yes. Mayak Familia has requested herbs from the 19th floor, so we should be able to collect them and return before it gets dark. Master Bell, here you go." She passed over the lunch Syr made for him, and Bell grinned thankfully, digging into his meal with gusto as Welf shuddered at the smell. "That's one hell of a stench, but if it's keeping you fighting like that, then it's obviously doing you some good. So, Lily, what's our haul looking like?" She peered into the bag and replied with a grin. "Good, very good. As long as we keep our masks on and allow Master Bell to handle the poisonous monsters, we won't have many issues." Bell was about to comment until suddenly another group came down the corridor and onto the floor. They were quite familiar to them, and Bell waved over to the Takamikazuchi Familia as they walked over, waving back. Mikoto walked over and pulled a strand of hair behind her ear as she asked curiously, "Bell, Lilianne, I don't believe we've met." Mikoto Yamato, Takamikazuchi Familia, Welf grinned as he thrust a thumb at his chest. Welf Crozo, Bell's contracted Smith and Hephaistos Familia. Mikoto nodded as the rest of the Familia introduced themselves. Once the pleasantries were out of the way, Bell asked curiously, "What brings you down to the 18th floor?" Uka explained, taking a seat as their supporter began to distribute stark-looking packages of food to the rest of them, though Mikoto had a near imperceptible resentment in her eyes as she stared down at the loaf of bread. "We have been tasked with going to the 19th floor and retrieving killer bee stings for the Goibnu Familia. It has been a while since we've gone to the floor, but I'm confident in our abilities." Before Bell could reply, Lily spoke up. "Well, it seems as if we're going to the same place, though we're searching for herbs. Perhaps we can work out an arrangement." Mikoto nodded and replied gratefully, "We'd be glad to. Having additional backup is always good on that floor. I'll be counting on you, Bell." He grinned back, a small speck of rice on the side of his face. "Me too." Lily smirked at the interaction as Chigusa sat next to her daintily, asking as the two began talking strategy while Welf sat with Uka and the other men of Takamikazuchi Familia. "Miss Lily." The supporter waved her off. "Please, just Lily." Chigusa nodded and asked nervously, Do you know what happened to Mikoto? She seems unburdened and carefree, and she's not giving our lord the attention he once garnered from her." Lily watched the two interact for a second, snorting at Mikoto's reaction to one of the sides Syr had prepared for Bell. "She's a free bird again. I'd be surprised if she wasn't feeling a little liberated. Reminds me of myself." Chigusa smiled softly before noting sadly, "Mikoto has been wondering what being a devil is like a lot recently. That sent Lily for a loop. She hadn't quite forgotten when she'd called Belle a child, but there had undoubtedly been a shift in attitude between the two. Heh. So, what would you do? If she asked to join us, that is. Chigusa shook her head in resignation, replying, I'd be sad. We have grown up together after all, but if that's what makes her happy, I'd support her. I'm surprised Mr. Cranel has triggered this change in her. Lily grinned as she replied with an endearing sigh. Belle's just that kind of guy, too damn loyal. You could find yourself on the 50th floor and he'd still come down to rescue you, and then be surprised when a girl thinks that's hot. The other supporter blushed nervously as they began to eat. Eventually the lot of them had finished their meals and Belle stood up and turned to Uka curiously. Today's our first day on the 19th floor. Is there anything we should know? My dungeon advisor gave me the basics, but Uka nodded as the now large party began moving for the large tree in the middle of the 18th floor. Everyone should keep an antidote on their person, even those with abnormal resistance. Killer bee swarms can be devastating if they get to the backlines, so focusing them is a good strategy. I believe yourself and Mikoto will work best on the front lines. I'll take rear guard, the others will make up the middle. They got into formation as they reached the base of the tree and began to make their way inside. Belle felt a little claustrophobic in the tight tunnels until they suddenly broke out into a large jungle. There were faint buzzing forms in the air, and the air was thick and humid. The monsters were a different breed than Belle had known before as well. While most he'd fought had been humanoid or at least reminiscent of the animals on the surface, the 19th floor began to introduce walking fungi and giant bees. However, after a few minutes, the rest of the party began to watch in shock as the two frontliners began to resemble a whirlwind of coordinated steel and fire. Belle and Mikoto weaved around each other with ease, covering each other's blind spots perfectly, and not even coming close to bumping into one another. It was just as Belle fired a firebolt into one killer bee when Mikoto made an upward slash with her own katana, splitting one from thorax to head in a clean sweep. The swarm killed. The two turned to each other and bumped fists lightly, giving each other a large grin as Belle said excitedly, making sure to keep his voice down. You're incredible, Mikoto. She shook her head and replied as the supporters got to work collecting the drop items and magic stones. I am nowhere near your abilities, Belle. That was an inspiring fight. Truly, I have much to learn from you. Lily sighed and called out chidingly. All right, you two lovebirds, break it up, we're on the clock. That's the 5 killer wasp stings for you lot, and we've got the herbs Mayak Familiar required. We'd best get going. The two frontliners looked a bit put out, but they didn't complain as they began to walk back up towards the 18th floor. As they walked out into the safe floor, Lily began to cough as Welf looked a bit pale in the face. W8, did you guys get? Lily waved him off as she said, trying to tough out the poison. It's nothing, Master Belle. I'm just dash. She was cut off as she began to cough again, and Belle sighed and pulled out an antidote, uncorking it and holding it out towards Lily, who just kept coughing, though to the rest of the party, it was obvious that she was bigging it up. Belle walked over and helped tip the potion into her mouth gently, holding the back of her head to make sure she didn't hack it up, even as Welf just took his own antidote and knocked it back without any problems. Much better. You doing any better, Lil Lily? Belle released the potion from her lips and Lily sighed dreamily with a wide grin. Just fine. Thank you, Master Belle. He grinned and set away the antidote. It's no problem, Lily. I don't know what I'd do without you. The Takamikazuchi familia were quite surprised by the interplay, even after Mikoto's stories about how the devils acted. They'd always seen devils as cold, ambitious people with less than welcoming personalities, so seeing how concerned Belle had been for the young girl who almost certainly had not required the antidote took them for a loop. Turning back to them, Belle said beseechingly, "Can we take a minute to let the antidote kick in?" Uka nodded as they all took a seat, and Lily sighed as she leaned against Belle for support. "Master Belle, may I?" Belle smiled down at her and replied, "Take as long as you need, Lily." Mikoto sat down next to them, conscious of the tender scene as she whispered, "You have quite the luck, Belle. I didn't expect we'd get 5 stingers in a week, let alone a day." He nodded and replied, trying not to disturb the resting Lily even though everybody else could see the triumphant grin on her face. "I've got a unique developmental ability. We think it's because of that. I've gotten a lot of drop items ever since I hit level 2. She accepted his reasoning and replied with a small smile. "That's quite the ability." After a few minutes of rest, where the two continued to talk as Welf spoke to Uka about something or other, they began to get moving again. None of them noticed a pair of eyes watching them from afar in Rivera as they began the journey to the surface. It was largely uneventful, and by the time they stepped out into the courtyard, the sun was beginning to hit the horizon. The loot was divided and Welf took a few drop items before asking with a grin, "Hey, guys, how about we hit a tavern?" The other men turned to him and Uka replied apologetically, "It's not prudent for us to drink. The funds would be better spent at our home shrine." Welf threw his arm around his shoulder and pleaded with a grin, "Oh, come on, our treat. None of the guys in Jefe Isto's familiar drink much." With that, they seemed to capitulate as Lily turned to Belle with a stern expression. "Now, Master Belle, I'll tell Riaz where you are, so be sure to be back before midnight. Don't drink too heavily, and don't follow strangers." Belle nodded as Welf snickered, whispering something about whips to Uka. Once he was released, he allowed Welf to lead them towards a dark, seething-looking tavern and led them inside. They were sat down at a large round table and Welf flagged down a prom waitress for some drinks. This place isn't the classiest, but it gets the job done. The first round was set in front of them, and Welf raised his tankard in a toast to a successful pair of quests. The table roared in agreement as Belle raised his tankard with an uneasy smile. The atmosphere calmed down and Belle added the occasional input to the conversation, and all in all, he began to relax. That was, right up until the table next to them began to cackle as a prom with a sun emblem on his shoulder said mockingly, "Yeah, word is that she didn't even notice the drink getting spiked. I mean, how dumb can you get?" Was probably smashed before the dancing even started. Belle's grip got stronger on his tankard as the prom continued, and Welf took note of his mood. These had to be Apollo familiar members. And then, get this, her brother has to step in to defend her honor. No wonder they sent her to Gakai, probably just humoring her. After a few breaths, Belle managed to calm down as Welf said under his breath, "They are idiots, don't listen to them." Taking another long drink, Belle let out a shuddering breath before standing up. I'm going to go." Welf's expression was concerned as Belle began to walk for the door, only to stall when the prom snickered and continued. And then, her partner goes and bags a dance with Freya and Loki, her sworn enemy. How pathetic can you get? Can't even keep her man on her arm for the night. Belle stalled for a second, and to Welf it looked as if Belle was going to turn and fight before he just continued out of the door. The smith stood up, apologized to the others as he threw down a bag of gold on the table and ran after Belle. Rushing out into the cold night's air, he walked up to his young leader and asked cautiously, "Belle, man, you okay?" He let out a long sigh before nodding, turning back to Welf with a glint in his eye that the smith had never seen before. It seemed angry and scheming at the same time. "Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for tonight, Welf, but I think I'm going to be busy tomorrow." His wings unfurled and he took off as Welf watched him go with a worried frown. Stepping back inside, he walked back over to the table and sat down as Uka asked, "Is he okay?" Welf wanted to say yes, but he frowned as he replied, wondering what Belle was planning. "I hope so." That night Belle sat in the office as Riaz tapped the desk. The entire peerage was sitting there, waiting for her judgment based on the report Belle had given her. Eventually she announced, "We have one option. If Apollo's official stance is that I am pathetic, then I declare war." Aquino's eyes widened in shock as she said incredulously, "Riaz, that seems hasty. Shouldn't we consider the diplomatic option?" She stood up and began to pace as she replied, "No, my brother need not get involved in this. This has become a personal insult. Aquino, prepare my parchment. Koneko, Lily, Belle. I'm sorry, but I ask for your help." Belle's eyes widened in surprise as Lily winced. "I guess it's inevitable if it's hit this level. Wars have been fought for less." He looked between her and Koneko for a second before humming and crossing his arms, nodding in acceptance. When he resolved to bring the matter to Riaz, he decided to accept whatever she decided to do, and if war was what was on the menu. He sat up and asked nervously, Do we need to kill?" Ria's eyes widened as she looked over to him in shock. Just as Aquino was about to speak up with an amused expression, Riaz spoke up seriously. "Would you do it? Would you kill in my name?" Belle's mind raced as he thought about doing it, killing a person. I couldn't, not unless one of you were in danger." Ria's expression softened as she nodded in satisfaction. "Good, I would be worried if you could kill easily. I will not ask you to attack another in cold blood, but a war game can be lethal if someone doesn't hold back. War games are considered the final stage in the diplomatic route, a single-event knockout fight between the forces of two parties designed to minimize collateral damage. Now, the question is now what we demand of them in the event of our victory. For the first time, Koneko spoke up, her voice scathing. Everything, take everything from them. They all turned to her in shock as Riaz said softly. Koneko, that would be disproportionate. Koneko turned to her with a soft look. You nearly got poisoned at that ball. That could have been it. If you had died. Ria's expression suddenly turned sympathetic as she replied, agreeing quietly. Indeed. Okay, I'll consider it. Otherwise, get some sleep you three. I'll be up late tonight. There's a lot to prepare. Koneko left, but Belle stood up and began to protest before Riaz gave him a soft smile. I know, I'm sorry, but I'll be late to bed. I'll make it up to you. K. He blushed as Lily cackled and grabbed onto his arm. I'll keep you warm, Master Belle, don't you worry. Besides, my magic training has been coming along well and I'm certain you'd like a demonstration. Belle was dragged away by Lily as Riaz waved him off with a smile. Once the door was closed, Ria's expression dimmed as Aquino said softly, sitting down on the desk after pushing a piece of paper out of the way. You're really this upset? Riaz nodded, explaining softly as she gazed at the door. Apollo has gone too far, embarrassing myself and Belle at that ball and then allowing his children to speak like that. I have to protect my name, for myself and the peerage. If we're seen as quick to bend the knee, then it'll only cause trouble for everyone. The Queen sighed before nodding and setting a piece of parchment in front of her. Riaz took an ornate pen and began to scribe down a challenge. They were silent as she did so, and eventually she finished and sealed the letter with crimson red wax. Her familiar flew down from the roof and took the letter before flying off and out of the window. Riaz sighed and leaned back in her seat before asking, Say, would it be improper for me to join Belle and Lily? They should be asleep by now. Aquino chuckled before replying, tilting her head. I'd say so, but when has that ever stopped us? Riaz smirked as she stood up and replied. Us. A bit presumptuous, Aquino. They began to make their way towards Belle's room, and Riaz opened the door as Aquino said with a slight pout. You've shared him with Lily, I'm starting to feel left out. Inside they saw the boy in question curled up with Lily, but they were surprised to see that Belle's wings were wrapped up around her protectively with a dopey grin. Riaz pouted as she whispered incredulously. He never does that with me. That little. Wait a second. As they got a better look at the pair, something seemed different about Lily, and after a second of inspection, it was obvious. She'd shrunk down to her original size as a prom, and 2 fluffy fox's ears had sprouted from her head that Belle was happily keeping his face tucked between like a blanket. Riaz couldn't help but coo at the adorable sight, and namely, Lily's ecstatic expression. Dropping her clothes, Riaz clambered over the two and cuddled into them as Aquino giggled, following suit though she wrapped her arms around Belle's waist instead. It was a tight squeeze with the 4 of them on the bed, but it was certainly cozy. The next morning the sound of birds chirping is what woke Belle up, though the feeling of a small body wriggling around in his embrace was what made him alert. The events of last night began to come back to him, the tavern, reporting what he'd heard, the declaration of war, and then Lily. She'd come into his room, smaller, and with a pair of perfectly fluffy ears that enthralled him. When she'd asked to sleep with him, well, what else was he going to do? Granted, that didn't explain the arms around his waist, or the red hair on the other side of Lily. There was a small moan in his ear from behind, and Belle stiffened as he heard a familiar sadistic voice behind him whisper, Morning, Belle, sleep well. Belle's voice caught in his throat as Aquino giggled, running her hand up and down his chest. Quite the impressive figure you've gotten, though you're still the little boy I know and love. You foo-foo-foo. He was about to say something before suddenly he felt her hand dip lower and grab onto his. Belle mentally begged his grandfather, Riaz, and whatever supernatural beings that would listen for answers, forgiveness, and strength respectively. Oh my, it seems those rumors about boys in the morning were true after all. There was a long pause in his mind as her grip tightened, but to make life just that harder, Lily let out a cute little yawn as she woke up and smiled up at him. Master Belle, good morning. He tried his best to not sound particularly pained as he replied, Morning, Lily. She tilted her head cutely and asked, What's wrong? Aquino retightened her grip, and Belle let out something between a choke and a wheeze. Thankfully she decided to have mercy on him and let him go as she spoke up. Good morning, Lily. Very good job on that transformation. Makes me jealous. At that Riaz woke up and said with an impressed smile, running her hand through Lily's hair as the girl moaned in pleasure. These ears are to die for. I don't blame Belle for using you as a hug pillow. After a few minutes, they were able to extricate themselves and Belle silently got dressed, feeling distinctly dirty as Aquino's lustful gaze on his back made his skin tingle. That was right up until Riaz said accusingly, "What did you two get up to on that side of the bed? You'd better not have sampled the goods before I have a kino." Belle's tensing said everything that needed to be said as Riaz smiled dangerously. "Oh, Aquino, I must ask you to refrain. Belle is saving himself for our wedding night after all." Lily turned to her with an incredulous expression as she said in disbelief, "Wait, that far away? I can't believe this. I was expecting a month or so. Though I guess it is pretty adorable." At that, Belle deflated as he affixed his holster, making for the door with his gaze to the ground shamefully. I'm just going to eat out this morning." Making his retreat, Belle almost immediately bumped into Koneko as he entered the corridor and yelped, Sorry." She blinked before looking up at him with a nod. "It's fine, come with me." Belle gaped for a second before realizing that it wasn't a request. Following the girl downstairs, he asked nervously, Miss Tuju?" Koneko replied shortly. "What?" He gulped before he continued, Do you need me for something?" The rook nodded as they stepped out into the light of day. "War is upon us, and I need to know what you can do. We're going to train." Belle nodded as he was led towards the walls of Rio and up and onto the ramparts. It was a familiar scene, though Belle was excited this time. When he'd trained the last time, it had given him what he needed to defeat Ryza. Koneko put up her fists as Belle unsheathed his knife, and they began to circle one another as they began to measure each other up. There were no openings in her stance, and Belle didn't have much of a chance as she rushed forward. Even with his speed, he was caught by the gust of air from her first strike, and he had to hurriedly extend his wings out to stop himself from falling to the ground. He glided back down to the roof as Koneko frowned disapprovingly. "Your center of gravity is too high. A strong magical blast or a strength-type fighter can disorientate you, and other agility types are stronger on the ground, making you useless in confined spaces." The harsh criticism made him shrink in on himself before Koneko began, raising her fists once more. "Lower your stance, bend your knees and don't use your wings to dodge. Use your footwork to keep yourself safe. Begin." The training continued, and Belle did his best to follow her instructions. The change-up in style was strange, and it felt unnatural at first, but as Koneko explained her reasoning it began to make more and more sense as to why she was having him fight like this. Devils are inherently suited to fighting monsters. The powers of the evil pieces allow roles to be easily divided, and it makes command and strategic decisions in the dungeon easier. However, in a war game, the battlefield is significantly different. The enemies have both strategists and the ability to premeditate counters. You need to find your weaknesses and fortify them. After a couple of hours, Belle was well and truly exhausted, but it looked as if Koneko was also starting to get tired. Sitting down against the rampart, Belle's stomach rumbled angrily as the rook nodded in satisfaction. "That will do for today. You've improved. This growth this quickly. That's skill. Anyways, we should go and eat." Belle nodded thankfully and stood up, following her down the fortifications. I know a tavern that has good food. I think it should be open by now." Koneko's eyes widened as she asked, "A tavern that accepts devils? Interesting. Show me." After a short walk, they found themselves standing outside of the hostess of fertility. Syr was sweeping up outside, but she turned to them with a pout. "Belle, you never came to get your lunch. You'd best spend a lot today." He laughed and scratched the back of his head. Oh, sorry, I never had a chance to come by. This is Koneko Tuju, my senior." Koneko nodded silently as they were sat inside the tavern, and Belle waved to the other waitresses and Liu as she passed by. "You seem friendly with them." Belle grinned and replied happily, Oh, they've been good to me. Syr makes me lunch every day, and they don't care that I'm a devil." Syr walked over and replied with a smirk, "Well, if he bothers to come and pick it up. Now what can we get you?" They placed their orders, and the waitress walked off as Belle asked Koneko curiously, "So, what does a war game look like?" She looked around, making sure nobody was listening in before she replied, "We can't tell until Riaz goes to the emergency donatus and the bet is placed. If it was a lesser conflict, it could have been settled with a duel between captains, but with this, it's likely we'll have a full-scale conflict between the entirety of our forces. Depending on if they agree to it, reinforcements can also be brought in from mercenary elements. Though as this is to secure Riaz's reputation, we have to be careful about how much we take in. If we allow someone else to do the work, the game will be for nothing." Belle nodded, trying to wrap his head around the situation. Their food arrived, and Syr sat down next to them much to Koneko's surprise. "So, What's the event? Usually, you'd be down in the dungeons, right? And I recall you saying that Koneko here wasn't your biggest fan. He laughed nervously at Koneko's unimpressed look as she began to pick at a fruit salad. It's a long story, but we were training this morning. I've still got things to learn. Syr blinked before asking curiously, setting her chin in her palm. How come? Something coming up. The two shared a look before Koneko replied shortly. We foresee conflict in the future. It is better that he's prepared. Syr smiled mischievously as she teased the boy. What have you gotten yourself into, Belle? I swear, it's something every week with you. His sweat dropped as he began to eat away at his meal. It was a little tense considering Koneko didn't speak much, but it was nice talking with Syr again. That was, right up until she dropped a bombshell on him that nearly made him choke. Say, I heard that at the Apollo Familiar Ball, you danced with Freya. How was it? Taking a large gulp of the tea that he'd asked for, he replied nervously. Well, she's very pretty, and she's a good dancer. But I think she's a little scary. Syr nodded and motioned for him to continue. It's like she was playing with me, like I was a marionette on her strings. It was a little exciting, She laughed and asked curiously, leaning forward to hear his answer. So if you had to say, who was the best dancer that night? Apparently somebody made quite the splash. Belle laughed and replied sheepishly, scratching his cheek. Well, I got a bit carried away, and I really couldn't say. She tried to coax an answer out of him, evidently enjoying his misery as Belle tried to avoid the question. Before she could succeed, however, another group walked into the bar, and Koneko tensed up at the sight of them. It was Loki Familiar's executives and their goddess, walking inside and calling out a loose greeting. Koneko stood up and made for the exit, only for Finn to call out to her. Tuju, didn't expect to see you here. For a second it seemed as if she was about to just leave, but she turned around only to bite back. Don't speak to me. Belle stood up and made to walk towards her only for Loki to call out happily, waving to the boy in a startling change from the other times they'd met. Oh Belle, so nice to see you again. He looked between her and Koneko for a second before shaking his head and turning to Koneko with resolve. Do you mind telling Lily that I'm not going to be back for a while? And I think Ria's wanted some green tea. She glared at him before he whispered, just go. Suddenly she seemed to understand that she was giving him an out, and she took it with nothing more than a nod. Belle turned back to the Loki Familiar only to yelp when the goddess in question grabbed onto his arm and asked excitedly, Hey Belly, why don't TCHA sit with us for a bit? Come on, my treat. Belle blinked in surprise only for Finn to turn his attention to him and give him an inviting smile. It's good to see you again. I trust you've survived your punishment. He laughed nervously as the rest of the Familiar laughed uproariously. Belle recognized one of them as Beat, the one who'd mocked him, and gulped as he was led over to sit between Loki and AIS. This was going to be a long lunch. Chapter 17. A tankard of ale was set in front of Belle as Finn asked curiously, though Belle had enough presence of mind to know there was a scent of scheming under his voice. What brings both of you here? I was under the impression yourself and Tuju weren't on good terms. Belle shrugged and replied, knowing that his loyalties were with Koneko more than the friendly captain. I don't think we are, even now. She was just training me. Finn's expression turned amused as he continued. Training you? What's the occasion? Don't suppose Miss Gremory has another suitor, him? He smiled at the implication before sobering up, replying softly. Precaution, after the events of the Apollo Familiar Ball. AIS frowned as she remembered watching Belle fall to his knee, her heart stopping in fear as he coughed up his lungs. Even Loki had been respectfully silent. No self-respecting divine liked watching a child suffer after all. Then, what? Belle nodded and replied quietly as the rest of the Familiar leaned in to hear the news. Probably, Apollo Familiar hasn't apologized, and they even insulted my mistress. I am sorry. I don't think I can share much more than that. Loki slapped him on the back as she grinned excitedly. No problem. This is going to be fun. I was wondering what that guild missive was. I'll need to read that when I get back. I wonder, what'll all Apollo do? There's yourself, who matches their captain in level, not to mention the Pissy Kitty and the Sadist Queen are 4th and 5th respectively. Gareth, a large dwarf, crossed his arms and said gruffly, Apollo ain't the honorable sort. He'll be looking for allies. Soma will do whatever for enough coin, and they've got plenty o' that. Belle hummed in worry as Loki continued in understanding. And Lil Riri has a reputation to think of and less coin. I wonder. The goddess fell silent as Tiona spoke up excitedly, her legs swinging under the table. "Hey Argonaut, do you think you could get us front row seats? I'd kill for another chance to see you fighting up close." Her sister slapped her around the back of the head before Tiona moaned. "Oh come on Tyon, you saw the recording from that duel. It'd be kick-ass." Belle laughed nervously until he felt AIS tug on his sleeve, and she looked over to him nervously. "I'd like it too." He gulped before he replied nervously. "I'll see what I can do." Suddenly Beat spoke up, refusing to meet Belle's eyes as he demanded. "You'd better not forget about my ticket. Got it, rabbit?" He nodded, stunned at the acknowledgement as he took another sip. The lunch continued, and just as they finished up, Loki asked Belle with a more serious tone than usual. "Hey, Belly, can you bring me to your peerage's house?" Belle's expression said exactly what he expected to occur should he do that, and Loki waved him off with a grin. "Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to start a fight. Just need to have a chat with her, all right?" It didn't convince him, but he nodded nonetheless. Standing up, he replied, "Okay, Lady Loki, but I can't promise she'll speak to you." Loki giggled in a way that surprised all of them, except perhaps AIS, as their goddess seemed much more feminine than usual. "Oh, you're sweet, Belle. I'll see you all at the manor, 'kay?" They made their way outside, and Belle was surprised when Loki grabbed onto his arm with a grin. "So, mind giving me a ride there?" Belle blinked in surprise before nodding and replying, "I'd be glad to, but how should I dash?" Loki jumped up, kicking her legs out, and Belle put his arm under her body by reflex as she laughed. "Like this, what other way is there to carry a lady?" He gulped before nodding, trying his best to look forward as Loki laughed at his reaction. While she knew this was more of a passing fancy than anything, like she had with her own children, she'd been thinking more and more about the moments of femininity that he seemed to bring out in her. Belle's wings extended, and with a powerful flap, they were soaring into the air as Loki whooped in excitement. "Woo! Is this how Lefia got carried? This is awesome." Making a beeline for the peerage's house, the two shot towards the house, and with a flare of his wings, the two gently touched down and Loki hopped off, dusting herself off as she noted, "I need to get myself one of you devils, much nicer than a carriage. Hey, I pay good rates, you know, wanna be my divine chauffeur?" Belle scratched the back of his head as he replied nervously, "I think adventuring is more my style." They stepped inside, and almost immediately they were greeted by Aquino. "Oh, Belle, didn't expect you to be back so soon. And is that? Oh my, Loki, what a surprise." The goddess threw up a victory sign as she explained, "Just need a chat with I. Think I've got a little proposition for her. Don't suppose she's too busy for Lil on me." Aquino nodded, still wary as she led them towards the office room. They walked in, and Riaz looked up in curiosity before her eyes narrowed. "Loki, what brings you to our humble abode? Can't imagine this is a pleasure visit." Loki shook her head and began with a measured voice. "Indeed, Riaz." That shocked all of them. It was more than uncommon for her to use someone's actual name instead of a nickname. Riaz sat up and leaned on her desk as Loki continued, crossing her arms. "I think it's about time we clear the air about everything between us. Not between Finn and Tuju or what happened with Himajima, just us." Ria's eyes widened before she nodded slowly. "Belle, Aquino, can you step outside? I think this should be kept behind closed doors, at least for now." The two nodded and left, and Riaz motioned for Loki to take a seat as she stood up. They both took their seats on opposing sofas, and Riaz began as her familiar brought over a bottle of Soma wine. "Considering you walked in with my Belle, I assume his lips are perhaps as loose as I'd feared. So, you're aware of my next step." Loki shrugged as the bat poured a glass and handed it to her, and she took a small sip as she replied, "Somewhat. Apollo hasn't apologized, his children have insulted you, and you need to build your reputation. A war game with him is the solution to all of those points, though you're severely outnumbered considering your goals." Riaz nodded as she asked without, for the first time in a long time, any hostility in her voice. "And you've taken an interest in this personally. Is this for Belle's sake, an opportunity to get at Koneko, or something else?" The goddess snorted as she replied, raising her eyebrow. "Ever the astute one, aren't you? Ari. Something else, though I've taken a liking to the kid. Namely, I need allies, strong ones. Freya's active, there was an irregular floor boss, and someone tried to assassinate the heir to Gremory in high-class ball. Who better to ingratiate myself with than the target in question?" Riaz swirled her glass, looking down into it impassively before replying lightly. "Our feud was going to end one way or another. Belle is too intertwined with your children at this point. So you want to at least pretend like we have some say in it. Loki laughed as she mused. Yeah, that kid's a force of nature, ain't he? AIS, Tiona, Lefia, and even that pup beat are fawning over him. Even if we kept hating each other, they'd still sneak out to go drinking, or he'll sink his teeth into my AIS and she'd be his love slave forever. The devil laughed at the image and replied bemusedly, I like to think he'd be a good master. So, is that it? Feud over. She nodded and the two took a long sip from the wine before Loki smacked her lips and began. So, first order of business, I'm planning on offering one of my children for your war game. A new member, 4th level Lefia Verdes. Belle must have told you about her by now. Tuju can only hate her on grounds that she's a part of my familia, and her magic would be useful in a war of attrition. I'd offer AIS and Tiona, but, Riaz nodded and picked up. Reputation. Keeping it limited to her will convey alliance rather than imply mercenary intentions. If she's willing, she's more than welcome. But the question now is what to give you in return, give and take after all. Loki snickered before crossing her arms and replying. If I was Finn, I'd demand a certain kitten, but I'm not. You drop that blackmail you have on me and we'll call it at that. With that, Riaz nodded and motioned to the door, and her familiar flew over and opened it. Belle and Aquino walked back inside as Loki called out with a grin. Hey kiddos, guess who's looking at your new benefactor? Belle's eyes widened as Aquino cupped her cheek curiously. Oh my, this is a turn of events. I was sure we'd be wiping up blood. Riaz chuckled before replying. Now Aquino, that's no way to speak to a guest. Shall we give her a Gremory greeting? Belle tilted his head before Riaz stood up and clapped her hands. Come now Loki, our bath has received some good reviews you know. The goddess gaped as Aquino began to lead her out of the office. Belle gaped as Riaz gave him a wink. No peeping, K. He couldn't do much but collapse onto the couch as the three walked away. Loki tried to protest as Aquino kept a strong grip on her arm. Hey, I'm not exactly much of a bath girl, you know. Riaz didn't even turn back to her as she replied. Oh please, you're plenty attractive when you want to be. As I understand it, a certain someone has their eyes set on Tiona Hiriute, so let's say he doesn't find you lacking whatsoever. Loki gulped as they reached the room and began to get undressed as she asked curiously. Wait, so he's seriously going for the gold? A full banquet of shapes and sizes with you as the main course? Aquino broke down into giggles as she spoke up. I'm not certain about that. Riaz seems more like a dessert if you ask me. The girl in question sighed and replied with a fond smile, hanging up her clothes as they made for the bath and sank into the warmth. If you mean a harem, then yes, but he doesn't quite seem to understand what he actually wants. He loves as much as a goddess of beauty, and he wants to express that love no matter the human's predilection for monogamy. Apparently, his grandfather placed the idea in his head that a true man should reach for the highest limits of debauchery with the largest number of women. Loki laughed as she settled down into the water. She had to admit, it was a nice change of pace, bathing in a communal bath without being laughed at by other supernatural beings. Sounds like he could have been raised by Zeus. That horned dog slept through half of Ororio, and he tried to get it on with the other half too. The small talk continued for a while, and by the time Loki made to leave, the moon had risen. Riaz and Loki stood in the street, neither speaking until eventually Loki spoke up, looking up at the sky with a faraway look in her eyes. A resurgence of the Gremory. Hell of a thought. Riaz chuckled before nodding and replying, joining her gaze into the sky. I wonder if this is the right option. If this works, it'll be unlikely that my servants will have easy lives. There's always going to be more conflicts, more enemies. Loki shrugged and looked back down at her junior. Despite how much they'd quarreled, she'd always had a begrudging respect for her desire for her servants' safety. Take it from someone who got there, the high life isn't always sunshine and roses. They'll go down into the dungeon, some might not come back, and you'll always be worried about who might not come home the next time. Where do you fit into this? She didn't offer anything, and Loki continued. You are their aegis, the shield against everything that seeks to harm them outside of the dungeon. The funds you accumulate, the allies you make, and the resources you gain access to are what you offer them. In return, they serve you, they will march on your enemies in your name and bring home riches that you can all share in. This game really is beautiful, don't you agree? Riaz leaned up against the wall as she whispered. Yeah, it is. The next day the excited babbling of the gods filled Babel as the emergency donatus began. Riaz sat silently at the large circular table. Her brother sat beside her as Apollo sat alone across from her. Surzex leaned down and asked once more. Are you sure you're ready for this, Riaz? Your casus belli may not endear you to a lot of them. Riaz nodded, tapping her finger on the desk impatiently. Yes, brother, I'm ready. If we're ready to begin. Surzex nodded and stood up, as did Loki. In the name of the 4 Satans, I call this meeting to order. Loki nodded and replied. As acting representative of the divines on behalf of the Guild of Rio, I, Loki of Asgard, acknowledge this. Gathered friends, we are here to discuss the declaration of war sent by Riaz Gremory, heir to the House of Gremory, to Apollo. Lady Gremory, let your grievance be heard. Riaz stood up and began, clearing her voice slightly. As many of you are aware, I was nearly poisoned at an event held by Apollo, namely a friendly ball. Only through the swift action of my servant was I spared that fate. Apollo then proceeded to sample the contaminated goods, confirmed that the drink was poisoned and was provided an antidote. In the time since, I have received no formal notice of apology or recompense for the suffering of my servant. In addition, I have reports that a member of the Apollo Familia was deriding myself and my servant. This blatant hostility and lack of willingness to admit his failings has prompted me to declare war on Apollo. Loki turned to Apollo then. Apollo, your thoughts? The god didn't even deign to stand up, inspecting his nails lazily. I accept. A loud murmuring of surprise went through the gods as Loki's eyes narrowed. Well then, that makes this easy. As the challenged party, you have the first condition to set and your desired reward in the event of your victory, on the grounds that it is deemed fair by this Donatus. Apollo grinned and replied, I declare that all outside help should be allowed to join. As for my reward, I desire Bel Cranel and Lilirukar Ard. Another loud rumble went through the crowd before Loki turned back to Riaz. Lady Gremory, do you have any objections, and what would you ask as your reward? Before she could reply, Apollo spoke up in boredom, brushing off a speck of dust from his robes. I care not for what she desires, ask away should you win. Riaz gritted her teeth at the dismissal but didn't say anything. His pride would be his downfall if she just kept her mouth shut. With that, Loki sighed and clapped her hands together. Perfect. Now that that's out of the way, war game time. Write your suggestions on the provided parchment and add them to the box. As for a neutral party, Hermes, mind handling this. The messenger god stood up and walked over to her as the box went around the table, each divine adding their own suggestion. When the box was finally brought back over, Hermes dipped his hand in, rummaged around, and pulled out a slip of paper. Unraveling it, he handed it back to Loki, who displayed it and called out, Castle Siege. Riaz's brow furrowed as it was decided unanimously that Apollo would be handling the defense while she would be on the attack. With the Donatus over, she stood up as Surzex said soothingly, Let's go back home, I'm certain the rest of your peerage wants to hear the news. She smiled up at him and they made their way towards the house, stepping inside to see that the entire peerage had been assembled in the office as Bel sat with a young red-haired boy while Graphia and Aquino sipped tea. Oh, Milikas, I didn't know you'd be here. The young boy looked up excitedly and rushed over with a happy laugh. Aunt Riaz, Mom said that something important was happening, and she said I could come too. Bel's really cool. Why didn't you let me meet him before? Why hasn't he come to the estate? Bel laughed as Riaz looked over at him with a bemused smile as Lily giggled from where she was sitting on the couch. Oh, you think so? Well, I'm glad to hear that you two are getting along. Now then, everyone. They all stood to attention as Riaz reported, a vicious smile on her face. It's a castle siege in a week's time. We're on the attack and all mercenary forces are permitted. Apollo has requested, should he be victorious, that Bel and Lily are handed over. He's written a blank check in return, and with that, we'll clean him out. Lily gaped as she stood up indignantly. Riaz, you actually put Master Bel on the line. Riaz smirked as she replied, I'm sorry, Lily, but when was losing ever an option? Not only will we win, but every single asset from the Apollo Familia will be ours. A fully decorated mansion and millions of Valis will taste all the sweeter when he loses and expects a slap on the wrist. Lily still looked uneasy as she crossed her arms and counted. And if they manage to pull a fast one on us? What then? At that Bel spoke up, nodding in agreement with Riaz. Then we pull a faster one on them. Do we know what their allies look like? Aquino began with a nod. Soma's mobilizing as a full unit, and it looks like various adventurer teams are signing on with them too according to the rumor mill. Additionally, we received a warning letter from the peerage of Sona Citri that teams of combat-ready devils are making their way to Gukai en masse. It would be risky to rely on our high levels to defeat them. However, it would be indisputable to say our advantage is access to such quality. As such, our best bet is an infiltration and assassination. Riaz hummed in thought before nodding slowly. I've got a few ideas. However, we need additional reconnaissance. Suddenly a voice piped up from the doorway, and they all turned in shock to see Hermes standing there with his ever-present secretary. Why didn't you just ask? Surzek's expression loosened as he gave the god a reproachful smile. It's rather rude to let yourself in, Hermes. The god grinned sheepishly before Riaz sighed and nodded. I'll let it slide. We could use access to your network, Hermes. Your price. Hermes shook his head and said with a flourish. Why, Riaz, my sweet ruinous darling, whatever do you mean? I am simply here as an ally. Have my familia not been tied to your family for years now? That was an overstatement. Surzek was his only point of contact, and that was just because he was the messenger god. However, Riaz wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth and thanked him nonetheless before replying. We need profiles on their members, all of those level 2 and above. Additionally, if you could loan magical artifact support, I'd be grateful. We don't need raw power, but cloaking would be appreciated. Hermes nodded and replied with a confident smirk, patting Esfi on the head. I'm certain my little Perseus has something in her arsenal. My people will have everything on your desk in 2 days tops. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can do. Make it interesting, pretty please. She sighed and turned back to the peerage and opened her mouth to continue, only for another person to make their appearance at the door. It was Mikoto, looking particularly out of breath as she bowed to them all lowly. Miss Gremory, I beg you, allow me to help you. Bell in particular was surprised, and he spoke up first. Mikoto, why are you alone? Mikoto stood up again and replied resolutely, her hand on the hilt of her blade as she replied. I'm your friend, aren't I? When Lord Takemikazuchi told me about the conditions of the war game, I couldn't stand by. And he has given me permission to leave. Again, she surprised everyone in the room. Riaz walked over to her and put a hand on her shoulder comfortingly. Mikoto, you're certain. You don't need to leave Takemikazuchi familia. They are your family after all. The girl nodded and replied. And they always will be. But something's changed. I don't know if it was the ball or something else, but I know I cannot flourish under him. So please. Riaz was silent for a long while as she thought. This wasn't what she'd wanted at all. She'd just wanted the girl to move on from Takemikazuchi as a lover, not as her patron. However, she turned back to Belle and Lily and asked, Belle, Lily, can you vouch for her abilities in the dungeon? Belle didn't even have a chance to speak up as Lily replied with a hasty nod. Absolutely. As much as I loathe to admit it, she is able to keep up with Master Belle in combat. Riaz smiled and nodded before turning back to Mikoto and pulling her into an embrace. That is more than enough for me. We'll conduct the ritual tonight, okay? Take a seat with Belle and Lily for now. Mikoto bowed once more before going over to join the two, giving them nervous smiles as Riaz continued. I'll coordinate our allies for tomorrow. Until then, none of you will be going into the dungeons. Akino, Koneko, I'm counting on you to devise an infiltration strategy and train all combatants in it. Otherwise, that will be all. Brother, Grafia, will you be staying for lunch? At that Surzek nodded and said fondly, I've been meaning to have a talk with Belle here, and I'm certain Milikas would enjoy some time with his aunt. May I steal him for a bit? The boy stood up as Riaz assented and instructed him. You know the rules, and don't let this Moran drag you into trouble. Belle pouted and nodded as Surzek laughed uproariously. The two walked out of the house with Hermes and Asfi in tow, and Surzek began with a grin. So Belle, don't suppose you have a favored tavern? I must admit, Arario's food isn't my speciality. He replied nervously, wondering if it was proper to bring a great Satan to a tavern of all places. Well, the hostess of fertility is a good place. At that Hermes with a flourishing bow. I do believe I'll get to work preparing those documents for Riaz. Enjoy yourselves, you two. The two groups parted ways, and Belle felt quite small standing next to the important figure. It was obvious judging from the whispering stares from the more clued in that Surzek was a known figure, and Belle gulped when some of the stares became slightly hostile. Surzek chuckled and calmed his nerves. It's unlikely we'll get attacked, not in broad daylight at least. Now Belle, I suppose I should be giving you the older brother talk as it were, but knowing Riaz, she's the one bulldozing her way through the courtship. Belle laughed nervously and replied, wondering exactly how much he should say. Well, it's pretty new to me. The elder chuckled and replied, ruffling his hair slightly as the tavern came into sight. No doubt, I'm sure romance was a way off in the future for yourself. Anyways, as to what I wanted to talk to you about, I was granted a peek at your stat-up sheet by Riaz, a raw version written in devil script. Belle blinked curiously as they entered the tavern and were seated. Surprisingly, Syr seemed less than inclined to go and greet them, and Anya was the one to serve them. Is there something special about it? Surzex hummed and leaned onto his elbows as he explained. Very. It's hard to explain to someone uneducated in the art, but something about the inherent structure of your excelia is different from both reincarnated devils and natural-born devils. It's contradictory at best, like you were already blessed, though Riaz assured me that you were bare when she took you in. Belle gaped in surprise and asked breathlessly, what do why you mean? Surzex shrugged with an apologetic smile. Not a clue, sorry. His sweat dropped as the elder laughed at the reaction. Don't worry about it, it's beyond my understanding anyways. With any luck it'll just be that you've experienced a divine event at some point. Now then, so this is your favorite tavern, eh? Well, the scenery is certainly appealing. Belle wanted to curl up and die as he watched Surzex inspect the waitresses with an appreciative eye. However, before he could say anything, Syr set down their orders and there seemed to be a moment of standoff between the waitress and Surzex. Both of them had locked eyes, and it was only when Belle gulped and asked nervously, is everything okay? Did they break the eye contact? Surzex nodded and replied, Of course, I was just a bit surprised. May I know your name, Miss Waitress? Syr seemed pleased with his response as she replied cutely, Syr Flover, at your service, great Satan Lucifer. Belle, I heard about the war game. Are you going to be okay? Word is you're on the line. He scratched the back of his head as he replied nervously, yeah, I am sure my seniors have a plan. She frowned in dissatisfaction before nodding slowly and walking away, a thoughtful expression on her face. Surzex watched her go with a worried eye before turning back to his food with a delighted expression. This looks delicious. They certainly don't skimp on the portions, do they? Let's eat. And so they ate, and Belle learned a bit more about the man who would be his brother-in-law while answering any questions about himself. Eventually they were finished, and Syr walked over with Liu in tow and the two sat down next to them. Surzex blinked and asked curiously, Can we help you too? Liu nodded and stared directly at Belle, asking bluntly, Mr. Cranel, may I join your forces for the war game? Belle gaped in surprise as Syr giggled, explaining proudly, Liu here's level 4, so you don't need to worry about her slowing you down. I'm just worried about the outcome. It'd be nice having someone I trust on your side. Surzex hummed in thought as Belle asked incredulously, Wait, Liu. I am grateful, but you'd fight with us. The elf nodded shortly and explained, You are Syr's destined partner. If you were under Apollo's thumb, it would be substantially more difficult for you to marry. Syr gaped as Belle nearly fainted. Surzex laughed uproariously before sobering up and replying with a wide grin. That's quite the reasoning. I'm certain my sister would be glad to have you. Please, be at the peerage house for tomorrow midday. I must say, Belle, you certainly have a way with allies, shall we say. Belle groaned as Surzex chuckled. This was going to be a long week. Chapter 18 again. Belle gasped for breath as he clumsily brought his knife to bay while Koneko and Liu stood opposite, their weapons drawn once more as Koneko ran him through his drill. It had been a few days since the beginning of their training for the war game, and the plan hinged on his ability to take out their general in a quick assassination ploy using his speed. Koneko wouldn't be able to get in quickly enough, and Akino's magic could be defended against with preparation and resources, of which the enemy familiar had in spades. Rushing forward, Belle slammed his elbow into the side of Koneko's fist, sending her off balance as he flared his wings to disorientate Liu, who went to follow up. Turning around, he caught her swinging wooden sword with the blade of his knife and had to jump back as she swept forward with her leg only to gasp in pain as Koneko got a hit on him. Tumbling, he landed on his feet and continued to try and break the pair down as the sounds of magic rumbling in the distance were accompanied by flashes of light and lightning, the sky of the underworld illuminated briefly each time. Eventually Koneko sighed and called out shortly, "Stop, that'll be enough for today." Belle fell to his knees, panting as Koneko and Liu also took a seat. The rook crossed her arms as Riaz walked up next to her and asked, "So, how do you like his chances?" Koneko shrugged and replied, her eyes trained on the boy as she gave her assessment. "Might win, might not, but he's better than I gave him credit for if he can handle my tactics. Don't let him know that." Riaz giggled at the final comment as she crossed her arms and reported. Well, Lefia and Mikoto have come along brilliantly under Akino's tutelage. We can expect them to do their role admirably. The special order from Welf has arrived. Finally, Lily is in position. The special present for Soma Familia is ready. The rook let a small smile show on her face as she noted. I'm excited for this. Her mistress scratched her hair, eliciting a small purr of contentment from the girl as she said encouragingly. You've done incredibly well, Koneko. Thank you for working so hard for me. And while I'm sure you don't care, Belle appreciates it as much as I do. Koneko sighed and crossed her arms, replying with a frown. I still don't like working with Loki Familia. What if that girl gets him hurt again? How can we trust them? Riaz was fine with letting her speak her mind in private company, but this was exactly the kind of attitude that she was dreading when it came time for them to work with Loki Familia again. Koneko. You know she wasn't involved with the incident. She wasn't even an adventurer at the time. Try. For me. She sighed and nodded, and Riaz gave her a grateful scratch before letting her go and calling towards the other two. All right, everyone. Let's get back home. No point resting in a place like this. The three got to their feet and Belle whimpered as his legs nearly gave out before Liu went over to catch him. He gave her a smile and said nervously, sorry Liu, my legs aren't listening to me. She nodded shortly even as a short blush stained her cheeks, not that Belle could see under her mask. It's fine, we've been at this all day. Shall we? She helped him as they all began to walk across the grey stone of the valley they were training in. When Riaz had told them they'd be training in the underworld, he'd been shocked and excited, but it has been even more surprising when he got a glimpse at the grounds of the Gremory territory. It was as expansive as Ororio, perhaps even more so, and the mansion in the center of it all was opulent in a way that he'd never known before. Flashback Belle and Lily's faces were glued to the windows of the carriage that the peerage and their allies were taking to the Gremory estate. The journey to the underworld had begun in the large carriage, and after a strange shift not unlike when Belle had first used a portal, they found themselves rumbling along the cobbles of a street unlike any in Ororio. Devils of all kinds passed next to the carriage, becoming increasingly well-dressed as the journey continued. Riaz was smiling softly at their reaction as she sat with the rest of the part, a wine glass perched between her fingers as Lefia, Liu, Koneko, Mikoto and Akino sat with their own. Lefia looked particularly nervous, sat between a glaring Koneko and impassive Liu, and eventually Riaz decided to take pity on her and ask, Lefia, may I have a word with you? The elf jumped, her wine nearly spilling before it got itself under control. Standing up, she walked over to join her as she sat down daintily. Miss Gremory, how can I help you? Riaz giggled before replying, taking another sip. Nothing like that. It just occurred to me that we don't know much about each other, even though our factions are now allied. Tell me about yourself. Lefia gulped before beginning. Well, there's not much to say. I reached level 2 at age 11 while I was with the school, and joined Loki Familia shortly after. I am a bit clumsy. And I really admire Miss Wallenstein. The redhead nodded, thoughtfully swirling her wine before replying. Very impressive. I've been a Baroness class devil since I was 13, and Akino was the first member of my peerage. I always wanted to ascend the ranking of the devil aristocracy. After all, becoming a duchess comes with some very attractive perks. Lefia blinked before asking curiously, if I may, how does that system work? I'm not familiar. Riaz giggled and began kindly, taking a liking to the inquisitive little elf. A highborn natural devil begins at the ranking of baronet. Upon reaching a suitable age and ability, they ascend to a baron or baroness and receive their evil pieces from the Beelzebub family. As a reincarnated devil, the first ranking is of a knight. Should they become distinguished for either service to their peerage or devil kind, they ascend to a peer. When a peer becomes strong enough according to a majority vote from the 4 great Satans, they can be offered the title of baron or baroness. However, they will be released from their peerage should they accept. Lefia nodded thoughtfully before asking nervously, casting her eyes to Belle for a second as he and Lily shared a grin about something. When does a peer become a baron? Riaz caught her look and gave her a conspiring grin. It can vary depending on moral character, but generally a first-class adventurer is the baseline. On average, a level 5 adventurer is around the skill my brother would consider a peer strong enough to warrant baronhood. Why do you ask? She looked caught in the headlights as Riaz giggled lowly as to not alert Belle or Lily. Don't worry, I expect that he'll reach baron sooner than I want. It's nice having him as a servant, though I'm sure he'll be a good master too. Lefia's mouth opened and closed like a fish for a few seconds before she sighed and muttered nervously. Ah, really? I feel like I'd be betraying Loki and Miss Wallenstein. Rias nudged her in the side and gave her an encouraging smile. Don't quote me on this, but I feel like you'd be following AIS. As for Loki, it's perhaps not my place to say, but she wants what's best for all of you. I fully expect Lily to follow Belle, and I have a sneaking suspicion Makoto will follow him as well. And you might notice that leaves a bishop free. She finished with a teasing lilt that made Lefia yelp and bury her head in her hands. Rias chuckled at the reaction as she turned to refill her glass. She wasn't usually given to day drinking, but it was always a good icebreaker, and this brand recommended by Loki was quite pleasant. Aquino sighed and spoke up. Oh, not worried about little old me. A young, spry master would be a nice change of pace. Rias snorted and retorted. As if there'd be a space for a queen, no doubt Lily is gunning for the position. And I can't see you as a rook like Makoto either. That seemed to alert the girl, who just turned back and put a finger to her lips with a conspiratorial grin. Rias smiled back as Liu piped up thoughtfully. Is a devil's harem limited to their peerage? I am not certain SYR would be comfortable with becoming a devil. Rias waved her off and explained. No, but it's not uncommon for peerage to exist solely as a harem. I doubt Belle would be able to resist the charm of any girl within touching distance, devil or not. Liu's face lit up at the mention of touching distance, as the carriage rumbled to a halt in a large courtyard. The door opened, and Rias set down her glass and took Belle's arm as she stepped down from the vehicle. Belle gulped as they were greeted by two middle-aged-looking devils, though from what he'd heard, middle-aged for a devil could range from 30 to 3,000. The man, with hair like Cersei's but with the addition of a well-kempt beard, greeted them warmly. Rias, it's lovely to see you again. And this will be the hero him? Zeoticus Gremory, it is a pleasure to meet you. Has my daughter been behaving herself? Belle gulped before taking the man's proffered hand and shaking it lightly. Bebel Cranel, you too, sir. As she has, though a little. Overbearingly. Zeoticus chuckled and continued as the rest of the party left the carriage. A curfew too. I swear, these Bale women are the domineering type. ACK. He was slapped around the head by the woman accompanying him, and it was obvious that Rias got everything apart from her hair from her. Be quiet, Zeoticus. It is for your own good and you know it. Venelana Gremory, a pleasure to meet you. Belle nodded and the rest of the introductions were carried out. Once they were done, they began to walk towards the large manor as Venelana explained, motioning to the west where a large rocky zone could be seen. You'll be sleeping here, and that area will be your training grounds. You shall have separate bedrooms. At that Rias spoke up indignantly. Mother. She turned back to her daughter with a small smile that belied the mirth in her eyes. No buts, Rias, you can live without him warming your bed for a few nights. Besides, I'm sure you'd rather I not have to bring out the memory album. Rias paled as Belle tilted his head curiously. Memory album. His fiancée frantically tried to stop the answer, but Zeoticus explained with a fond grin. It cost a pretty penny, but it can record an image into a magical book. Ria's first bath, the first time on a horse, that time she ran around in her mother's wedding dress. Ah, memories. Belle smiled as Rias held her face in her hand, imagining a small Rias playing around the large manor. Aquino giggled from behind them as she came up to walk next to them. Oh, I was hoping to see some of those again. She really was much cuter back then. Venelana turned back with a knowing smirk as she replied lightly. Careful now, Aquino. Need I remind you that you featured in them as well? Why, I'll need to show Belle the wedding ceremony from when you two declared your love for each other at age 6. Grafia was a very pretty bridesmaid if I do remember. Both Rias and Aquino shouted in indignation as Belle broke down into laughs at the mental image. Soon enough they were led to their individual rooms, large and opulent as the rest of the mansion, and their first day of training began shortly after. End flashback. The troop of exhausted trainees walked into the Gremory estate and Belle detached from Liu to catch a rushing Milikas. Belle, it's happening tomorrow, right, right. Belle laughed and ruffled the little guy's hair. He reminded him of himself when he was that age. Yeah, it's tomorrow. Cheer for us, all right. Milikas grinned and replied excitedly, bouncing in his shoes. Yep. Mother said that father got us seats in the viewing gallery in Babel. Belle blinked in surprise as he looked up at Rias, who just shrugged and explained. It's not uncommon. He is the great Satan Lucifer after all. I'll be there too, though it's required since I have to be there to honor the bet. He nodded in understanding as Grafia walked over and chided Milikas. You mustn't bother Master Bell Millikers. I'm certain he'll want to rest for tomorrow's fight. Please, excuse him. He laughed and scratched the back of his hair. It's fine, really. They dispersed to get washed up, and Bell sighed as he stood in the spray of water from the shower, scrubbing the dust from his hair and using the provided soaps that he'd been told to use by Rias. It was a far cry from the weekly river baths he'd had in his home village, but it was much nicer than those cold baths with fish rushing past him. Stepping out of the in-suit, Bell yelped when he saw Leffia sitting on his bed. Her hair was still mildly damp, and she seemed slightly nervous about something. Leffia, see, can I help you? She gulped as she averted her eyes from his bare torso, considering he was in his towel. Why you can get dressed? Sorry, I wasn't thinking. Bell nodded, a little worried by her expression as he grabbed the loungeway provided by the house. Getting dressed behind a screen, he walked back out, pulling the shirt on as he did so. Leffia glanced over to him for a second before shouting, evidently trying to rip off the bandage as quickly as possible. See, can I sleep here tonight? He gaped at her as he tried to process what she was saying. Leffia looked to the side nervously, an embarrassed blush covering her cheeks as she explained. I am nervous. These rooms are too big. I'll sleep at the end of the bed or the sofa, but please. It was evident she was expecting rejection, but Bell didn't have any reason to deny her. She was nervous, just like he knew Lily was before she went off to perform her task for the war game, though she'd put on a brave face. Not to mention it wouldn't do for her to be tired for tomorrow if she couldn't sleep. Giving her a soft smile, he nodded and sat down next to her. It's fine, we can share the pillows. And no point in being uncomfortable, right? Leffia nodded vigorously, agreeing. Why yeah. I need to be on top of my game tomorrow. If I didn't rest my mind properly, I might screw up. Bell frowned at how she trailed off like that. It was obvious she was scared. Leffia, you know you can talk to me, right? She looked up at him in surprise as he scratched his cheek with a nervous laugh, turning away from her as he continued. I am not as amazing as AIS, or as smart as Reveria, or even as confident as Beat. But, if I can help, I'd like to. Damn this boy. Damn him to the lowest circles of hell. Somehow he'd wormed his way into her young heart where only Miss Wallenstein used to reside. Leffia wasn't a seer by any stretch, but something about him seemed great, like destiny itself was waiting for him to shine. He was young, and technically weaker than her since he was a level behind, but she couldn't help but see him as a leader. Gulping, she replied with a small smile. I am fine, better than fine. It's just, I've always worked in big teams, with my cines there to keep everyone safe if I mess up. What if I screw up and one of you gets hurt? You and Lily are on the line here. Bell reached over and nervously let his fingers touch the back of her hand, and Leffia jumped at the contact but didn't pull away. She turned to him nervously as Bell said staunchly, Leffia, you agreed to help us. To help me. This may be a bit presumptuous, but I feel like I can rely on you as a partner. I trust you. I know that you'll try your best tomorrow, just like everyone else, and I'm so grateful. Leffia's heart thudded in her chest as she heard him say those words, and with every thump, her determination grew like a wildfire in her heart. He trusted her. He saw her as a partner. Miss Wallenstein never relied on her. Reveria could wield magic better than her. They could very well go on without her if need be. But Bell called her his partner, someone he could rely on. Suddenly she gripped his hand and smiled at him with a determined grin. You've got it. We'll win this thing. Together. I bet everyone's going to be so jealous when I tell them about my stay here. I'll blow them away with how much I've improved. Her excitement was contagious as Bell laughed and grinned back. Yeah, when we're through with them, they'll be sorry. After a few minutes of nonsense cheers that got sillier and sillier as time passed, the two flopped back down to the mattress, giggling about the unlikely situation. Leffia turned her head and asked Bell, all of her nerves gone. Hey, can I see your wings? Bell rolled onto his front and Leffia sat up, marveling at the white leathery skin that felt so soft under her fingers. Bell stifled his moans of pleasure as Leffia mused. I didn't really get a good look at them on the expedition. So pretty. He nodded mutely only for her to run her finger along one of the ridges, ripping a pleasurable sigh from him. Leffia yelped and retracted her hand, and Bell couldn't stop his wings as they drooped in disappointment. Sorry. Did that hurt? The boy shook his head and replied nervously, wondering how much he should share. It's not that. But. It feels. Nice. Leffia looked down at him in shock, her eyes moving between the offending hand and the wings for a second before nodding resolutely. There was nothing weird about this. It was just a pre-game massage. Absolutely necessary. Tiona and Loki told her that massaging was a completely normal thing to do. Her fingers danced across the flesh again as Belle looked up at her in shock. Lefia. Why you re-dash? She cut him off with a shaky smile. It feels nice, right? That just means you'll do better tomorrow, and we've got to do our best. Belle gaped at her before smiling thankfully and letting his head hit the mattress again. Thank you then. Right there. The young elf was enjoying the effect she had on the boy as his face melted into a pleasurable bliss. She got a little more forceful, massaging the muscle and bone deeply to work out the strange knots that had formed. So engrossed in her task was she that when she next realized the time, it was to the sound of her stomach rumbling. Dinner. We need to hurry. Belle looked up at her with a sleepy expression, still mired by the bliss of the massage. What? The door creaked open, revealing an unimpressed-looking Riaz. So this is where you two have been. Belle, wait, what are you two doing anyways? Lefia raised her hands as if displaying that she didn't have any weapons as she nervously replied. I was just helping Belle relax for tomorrow, just a little massage, and nothing more. I promise I wasn't doing anything untoward. Riaz broke down into laughs as she waved her off, walking over to sit down on the side of the bed. It had been a long few nights without her favorite pillow, and she was glad to see the young elf she'd taken a liking to was showing some initiative. A massage sounds really good right around now. Couldn't ask for one myself. Lefia was saved by the sound of her stomach rumbling again, and she gripped it, willing for it to stay silent as Belle got up, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Riaz. She planted a small kiss on his cheek as she stood up and said, All right, you two, let's go down and get some food in us. Can't be massaging on an empty stomach, can we? The two were led out of the room by the grinning redhead as Lefia looked for any sinkholes she could jump into to escape the embarrassment. Arriving at the dining room, they sat down in their usual seats, though there was an addition to the usual table guests, namely Surzex. Riaz blinked in surprise as she sat down. Brother, I didn't hear that you'd be here tonight. The man gave her a grin from beside his father as he explained. Well, I have to see tomorrow's victors before they set off, right? So how's everyone feeling? There were a few general nods from the peerage and allies, and Surzex turned to Belle with a surprised eye raise. You seem a little out of it, Belle. Nerves. Belle made to reply before a yawn interrupted his train of thought. Blushing in embarrassment as the rest of the table laughed at his misfortune, Belle began to eat up as Riaz asked Lefia in mock teasing. What have you done to him? Should we have been weaponizing your hands instead of your magic? Lefia yelped before following Belle's lead. The dinner continued, the small talk amiable until they were all full. Belle leaned back in his chair with a satisfied sigh until blinking in surprise when a wine glass was poured in front of him by a servant before she poured another for both Zeoticus and Surzex. The eldest began, raising his glass as he looked over to Belle. I suppose we should get this out of the way. To the next man of the Gremory household, Belle Cranel. Belle raised his glass nervously before lifting it to his lips and taking a sip from it, not used to the rich taste. Surzex downed the thing in a single gulp before sighing in delight and speaking up happily. It's so good to have a good brother-in-law. I swear, if I had to endure that snot-nosed little chicken riser every time I got to see Riaz, I'd do things that would get me banned from Gokai. Riaz seemed to understand what was going on and let her head hit the table with a groan as Venelana giggled, explaining to a curious Makoto. These idiots have been waiting to induct Belle as one of their own since he arrived. Men will be men after all. Zeoticus continued with a hollow chuckle. Don't I know it? Damn that Lord Phoenix. Uppity little. Thank you, Belle. Honestly, I can't imagine my little Riaz with the spawn of that slimy little chicken. Make sure to give me some cute grandchildren. The boy in question gaped as Riaz's groans got louder. Surzex topped off his wine, motioning for the servant to set down the bottle as he said with a large grin. Yeah, Milikas needs some playmates. You're already in his good books as his uncle-in-law anyways. What's the hold-up? Is my little sister not good enough for you? Or is it some kind of responsibility thing? Come on, tell us. The others at the table were either staring incredulously at the sudden shift in attitude, frowning at the crass topic of conversation, or snickering at Belle's nervous expression. Well, I'd like to save it for our wedding night. Surzex nodded with a lecherous grin, stroking his chin sagely as he said approvingly. Respectfully kinky, the best kind. Oh, Belle, you are wise beyond your years. A toast to your ways. The man downed his glass, and it then became clear to Belle that the two men were just looking for an excuse to get drunk. Setting down the half-full glass, Belle stood up and said apologetically, "I think I should get to sleep. Thank you for dinner, Mr. and Mrs. Gremery." Venelana giggled and replied warmly, "Of course, and please, call me mother. Sleep well." Belle bowed and left the room, returning to his room while replaying the embarrassing event in his head. That was intense. He'd never known the Gremery patriarch to be so merry. Arriving at his room, he took off his shoes and sat down on his bed. Soon after, the door opened again, revealing both Riaz and Lefia in their sleepwear. The young elf looked particularly nervous as Riaz giggled and walked over, lying down on his bed and getting comfortable. "Mother's given me permission to sleep here tonight, and imagine my shock when I find Lefia had the same idea. So in exchange for me not ratting her out, Lefia rushed over to lay down on the other side of the bed, screaming into one of the pillows as Riaz finished with a satisfied smirk. I really am too good a wingwoman, aren't I?" He sighed and nodded, too tired to argue as he lay down next to Lefia, pulling the covers up and over the two as Riaz shouted in indignation. Scrambling under them, she smirked when she saw that Lefia had already wrapped her arms around his waist and was refusing to meet her eyes, keeping her face firmly on Belle's back. Riaz was about to turn over to lay on her back, resigned to being able to sleep in the same bed until she felt a pair of arms wrap around her. She looked down at Belle in surprise as he whispered with a nervous smile that made her heart flutter, "I missed you too, you know." Ria's expression brightened as she leaned into the hug, her free wing extending out to cover both Belle and Lefia in a loose embrace. "Yeah. I thought I'd grow out of being excited for my birthday by the time I was an adult. Good night, Belle, Lefia." Belle chuckled as he settled down, and Lefia mumbled her own good night, not relinquishing her hold on the boy. Riaz had told her just outside of the doors to enjoy the night, and if she considered that the devil was her temporary boss, it could be construed as an order. The feeling of his skin against her own, the way his muscular back rippled, and soft warmth coming from the wing that covered her. She really could get used to this. Now she just needed to make sure they won tomorrow. Chapter 19. The sound of excited chatter filled Rio as the Gremery peerage and allies finished loading up their cart. Belle wiped his forehead and gave a polite wave to the crowds of cheering spectators as Aquino giggled next to him, watching as the rest of the peerage finished their own tasks. "Why, you're quite the popular one, Belle. I feel left out. You'd think some of them would be interested in little old me as the captain." He smiled up at her and replied, "Ignore them. They are blind if they don't notice you. Is everything ready?" Aquino smiled down at him sweetly as she motioned to the first carriage where the rest were sitting. "All ready and waiting. Care to address your adoring fans, you little charmer?" Belle pouted at the teasing before gulping and nodding, knowing that it was necessary. Turning back to the crowd, they all fell quiet as he cleared his throat. A long moment of silence before, "Wish me luck." There was a general scream of female appreciation as the citizens of Rio yelled at the adorable boy. Aquino led him back to the carriage and Belle stepped into it as Mikoto said amusedly, "Wish me luck." Belle pouted and crossed his arms, looking to the side petulantly as the others laughed at him. "I wish Lily was here. She wouldn't make fun of me." Lefia sobered up and said sweetly, "It's fine, Belle. It was pretty cute. The public seemed to think so anyways." Belle sunk further into his funk as the carriage began to roll towards the gates of Rio. It was a short journey, and when they arrived, two people walked into the carriage. One of them was a member of Ganesha Familia if the elephant mask was anything to go by, and another was Aina. The receptionist pulled a lock of hair behind her ear as she smiled down at Belle, a clipboard in hand. "First you don't stop by in a week, and then I find you leaving Rio with a carriage full of women. I swear, Belle, I don't know how Riaz handles you." He gulped as Aquino giggled. "Well then, Aina, is everything in order?" She looked down at her clipboard and nodded, listing off. "All members are now registered for their leave, though one Lilaruka left 2 days ago ahead of you. Is this correct?" Aquino nodded and Aina sighed and set away her clipboard as she said warmly, "All right, everyone, I know I should be impartial, but I do have a month's wage on your victory. Good luck, and don't get yourself hurt too badly, Belle. Have fun storming the castle." He laughed and nodded as the two left the carriage and it rumbled along once more. He leaned back against the wall as he stared out of the window at the familiar scenery. Makoto noted his gaze and asked curiously, "Belle, you said you came from the northern mountains, right?" Belle pointed to the distant peaks as he replied with a soft smile. "Yeah, a little village up there. There was a stream, and a woodland full of game." His gaze became distant as he remembered his time there, his grandfather's smile, the quietness of it all. In the past months, his life had become so rapid that he barely had time to smell the roses. He briefly wondered if he should go back at some point before shaking his head. There would be time for that later. Today, there was a castle to storm. Babel Tower. The muttering of various gods and high-ranking devils filled the viewing gallery of Babel Tower as they waited for the day's events to begin. Various bet-takers stood on all floors of the tower, calling out odds and bigging up potential profits as they did so. Riaz sighed as she leaned back in her throne, her nerves starting to take hold as Milikas babbled excitedly to his father next to her. She was sitting with her family and allies, namely Loki and the executives of her familia. Apollo was sitting by his lonesome off to the other side of the room, accompanied by a few gods and devils. Sona had given them good information. There were devils amongst Apollo's forces, probably from lower-ranking devil families looking to expand their riches. Surzex gave her a comforting smile. "Come on, where's the confident Riaz that sent Aquino and the others off?" Riaz shrugged and replied, "It's hard not to be cautious. I'm sending my peerage to war for the first time after all, and we couldn't have chosen a bigger enemy." Loki smirked as she spoke up from where the executives had been sitting. "Go big or go home, RIRI. Come on, have a little faith in my Lefia. Your bow seems to after all." Indeed, Bel had vouched for the Thousand Elf's skill, and Riaz had seen what she could do, but she was afraid of what she'd do if under pressure. Crossing her legs, Riaz blinked when one of the executives bounced over and asked excitedly, "Hey, Miss Gremory." "Excited. How's Argonaut feeling? What's the plan?" Riaz smiled down at her as she replied warmly, "Tiona, please, call me Riaz. I think I'll leave describing the plan to my forces though, and Bel's excited for his training to pay off." At that, Finn walked over and sat down on the long sofa next to her, crossing his legs as he observed. "He has been trained by Tuju, correct? I admit, I am excited to see how he performs. He's getting close to her level by now after all." Riaz gently admonished the man. "If you wish to sink your claws into him, I'm afraid you have a line of women to wait behind." Finn laughed before waving her off. "I assure you, I won't do anything untoward that he doesn't also agree to. However, I don't think I can speak for Beat." Indeed, the werewolf was in the process of shoving a large pile of money into one of the bet-takers' hands while shouting angrily, "Everything on the rabbit, why here?" Riaz giggled before sighing and turning back to him. "I'm certain he would agree, but it's still uncomfortable knowing he'd sign on to one of your lower-floor expeditions. Granted, I assume he'd have only the best protection should he be with Tiona and AIS." Tiona grinned, scratching the back of her hair as she crossed her legs and replied, "You know it. I'm excited to see how far Argonaut can go, and I'm not lying when I say I'm not adverse to staking my claim. Don't mind a flat-chested girl, do YA." Riaz hadn't seen a girl this open about her desires since Aquino and laughed, replying fondly, "Of course not, and I think we both know he doesn't either. I believe we should be starting soon." Hermes was standing at the front of the crowd, looking out of a large window with his expression covered by his cap. The wind gently billowed around him, and on a particularly gusty breeze, he turned around with a flourish and called out, "All right, everyone. I believe the time is nigh. Take your seats, and please keep conversation to a minimum. The show is about to start. Uranus, may we have permission to use our arcanum?" Uranus, the first god on Tenkai, was the only one of the divines with the authority to use arcanum. It had been a point of contention between the devils and divine, but after it was clear that Uranus could be trusted, the devils acknowledged his authority on Gakai. A booming tone echoed throughout Babel, and Hermes grinned as the gods began to channel their power to him. The messenger god snapped his fingers, and suddenly magical mirrors manifested in every major tavern, familia, and peerage headquarters across Gakai and the underworld, windows that displayed a large, desolate castle bustling with activity. There were a few seconds before the display warped, now displaying the other force leaving their carriage on an overlooking hill before it rolled away back from whence it came as the cat was detached from it. Riaz leaned forward as she saw Aquino begin to coordinate the team, smiling as she saw her queen hand both Lefia and Bel individual masquerade ball masks. The two said their goodbyes and began to rush in opposite directions, putting on the masks and becoming invisible much to the consternation of Apollo and the interest of the crowd. Meanwhile, Makoto and Aquino began to walk towards another hill while Koneko and Liu began to rush towards the fortress, the latter carrying a single large sword ornately decorated. A certain red-haired smith's brow was furrowed as he saw his latest creation, the one that he'd made for his friend's sake. Gripping a tankard of ale with a frown, Welf took a sip before sighing at the sour taste. Use that damn thing well. On the ground, Koneko rushed up to the gate, dodging the arrows sent to her by the guards. Leaning in the only cover provided by the portcullis, she waited patiently until she heard the sound of an explosion rocking the castle and performed a roundhouse kick, sending the metal flying into the ranks of defenders. They were many. The entirety of the Apollo and Soma Familia along with mercenary forces was nothing to scoff at, but thankfully they'd been prepared for this. Koneko smirked as a series of barrels broke open around the forces and a sweet, wintry smell covered the courtyard. The Soma Familia members began to scramble towards the barrels as their captain, Zanis, screamed out in frustration as the formations began to dissolve into chaos. "What are you idiots doing? There's an enemy right in front of us." He was nearly trampled by his own familia as they began to fight over the last dregs of true Soma wine in the barrels as Koneko began to fight the unaffected. A prum boy looked down from the battlements with a satisfied smirk as he began to make for the eastern wall. Just as planned. If only I could go to Master Bell. I'm a mess. As he did this, his body began to light up in a bright glow, enveloping him for a second before revealing a new form with white hair and wings. Standing there was Bell Cranel, though in truth, it was a very irate Lily. Damn Rias, I bet she and Master Bell got all lovey-dovey without me, enjoying that manner without me. I'll give her a piece of my mind when this is all over and done with. A large gong sounded across the valley as thunderclouds began to roll in. A large purple magic circle formed over the courtyard, sending all the lower-leveled combatants onto their knees while the third and fourth levels managed to stay standing. Koneko breathed heavily as she endured the gravity magic, already tired from the intense fighting. One of the devils hoisted a large khopesh over his shoulders as he jeered. "This your plan, girlie? Gotta say, I'd expected more from the Gremory peerage." Suddenly a thunderclap came from the distance, and Koneko had to shield her eyes as the courtyard was illuminated with a flash of light. She'd placed herself under the gate to ensure a level of protection, but the lightning bolt still shocked her to her core and made her hair stand on end. "Aquino, I still can't reach you, damn it." The light faded, and Koneko shook herself as she stared out at the piles of fried adventurers. Some of them were trying to get up, but with a few strikes, they were unconscious before they could even stand. Koneko watched as another blast covered the east side of the castle and smirked. Now it was up to her juniors. Lefia took a few breaths as she leaned on her staff, regaining her breath as Lily, disguised as Belle, raised a look-alike for the boy's knife as if taunting the guards that were scrambling away from the duo. "Do you think that got their attention?" Lily turned back to her and nodded, setting the knife in its sheath as she replied in Belle's voice, and Lefia couldn't help but gulp as she heard the usually warm voice of her crush be replaced with cool pragmatism. "We'll need to wait until they report it back to their commander, but undoubtedly they will. I just hope Master Bell heard that over the thunder." The plan was going well, and Lily smirked as she thought about getting back at the bastards she'd once called her familiar. Watching as Zanis got trampled was particularly vindicating, and knowing that the wine had been their downfall was the icing on the cake. Liu, wielding a magic sword made by their personal smith, had taken out the scouts and sentries that may have alerted the enemy forces to Bell's infiltration strategy. Now all they needed to do was make chaos. Bell lay in wait as he watched the throne room of the castle from the rafters, knowing that attacking the clearly visible commander would be a death sentence as it was. The commander, one Hyacinthos Cleo, was surrounded by very powerful-looking devils, adventurers, and other bodyguards. One of the guards, a dreamy-looking girl with a staff and accompanied by a sour swordswoman, was trying to convince the commander of something until the door burst open. "Yes, sir. I've got news. The courtyard team was wiped out immediately, and it looks like the Thousand Elf and Little Rabbit are on the eastern front. It's a disaster." Hyacinthos growled in anger before sighing and replying with a cocky grin. "Let them try. Even with the fallen angel, they'd be killed if they tried to get in here. Looks like we'll just need to wait them out, damn Zanis." The girl continued in distress. "See, Captain, if we don't find the real rabbit, he'll devour the sun." Hyacinthos glared down at her and said angrily, "Cassandra, not another word out of you. I'm much too busy to hear about your silly dreams. Daphne, keep her quiet." The redhead put a firm hand on the girl's shoulder, and she looked about ready to give up until Bell suddenly had a stroke of genius. Pulling off his mask for a second, he waved down to her with a pleasant smile until she gasped and pointed up at him. "I tease him. He's up there." It was too late. Bell had already put on his mask on. Hyacinthos looked up sharply before roaring in anger as he glared down at her. Cassandra, what did I say? Daphne, put her in the storeroom, I'll handle her later. None of you move from here. The redhead, Daphne if Belle was correct, sighed and grabbed the distressed girl and tugged her towards an adjacent room. Belle swept down the wall silently and kept in step with them to mask his movements, just managing to sweep inside before Daphne closed the door. She blinked curiously at the slight gust of wind before shrugging and turning back to Cassandra in the dim storeroom. Cassandra, what were you thinking? Just stay in here. I'll try and make sure Hyacinthos doesn't punish you too much. The girl tried to speak up but was cut off as the redhead turned away and left, slamming the door. Her hand lowered as a sad expression covered her face, and Belle couldn't help but feel pity for the girl as she whispered, "Why doesn't anyone believe me?" There was a decision to be made: stay silent and get ready for the kill, or comfort a cute, sad girl in her time of need. Belle's decision was a short one. Of course there was only one option in this situation, one logical, smart and calculated move that would ensure victory. Why don't they believe you? The girl's expression turned to terror as she was about to shout in fear as Belle took off his mask before he hurriedly shushed her. Hey, sure, I don't want to hurt you, or get violent. Cassandra nodded, her eyes still warily on his knife as Belle laughed nervously. Well, I guess you know my plan then. I know it's a little treacherous, but I won't knock you out if you don't try to alert them. Okay. The girl looked between him and the door for a few seconds before nodding, looking down as she slid to the ground against a wall. Well, I have these dreams, they're like prophecies. I had one last night of a rabbit sneaking up to the sun and devouring it, because the sun thought the rabbit in the moon was the real one. Nobody ever believes me. Belle couldn't help but feel for the girl. She looked so downtrodden that he couldn't help but want to comfort her. Giving her a grin, he explained. Well, you're about right. That was our plan. That's an amazing ability you have. Cassandra looked up at him in shock before a happy smile broke out on her face, a red dusting covering her cheeks. Really? Why you believe me? Belle nodded fervently, replying with a smile. Of course, you were right after all. A seer. Wow, that's so cool. Your captain is an idiot not to take advantage of it. Every hero listens to the seer after all. She sighed and traced a circle on the dusty floor. HHE's just busy. Sigh, I wish I never joined this familiar. Belle blinked in surprise and motioned for her to continue, and it seemed like she was more than happy to have someone to talk to. Well, me and Daphne were on the run because Apollo had us in his sights. He chased us to the ends of the world, and eventually, we gave in. HHE's horrible, so aloof and uncaring, only caring for us as baubles. He frowned before giving her a determined grin. All right, when I win, I'll ask Rias to release you and your friend. I may have a vendetta against him too, and some of his familia. Cassandra giggled and replied with a nervous smile. Why, you were the one who got poisoned, all right. You were a very good dancer. I wish I could have danced. There was an underlying question in her eyes, but she refused to meet his gaze, and Belle grinned before extending his hand to her, standing up. May I have this dance, my lady? Cassandra looked up at him in shock before taking his hand nervously. But I am your enemy, all right. Belle gave her a nervous smile as he began to lead them through the steps of a dance to an imaginary beat. I like dancing, and that night turned an enemy into a friend. Besides, not like there's anything else to do until Hyacinthos gets here. Cassandra gulped before nodding and smiling as she was gently spun around. It had been a long time since she'd met someone who believed her, wanted to be her friend, let alone someone this nice. Everyone in her familia were mean to her apart from Daphne, and even she could be prickly at times. But the way he held her, spun her around, held her close. It was positively sinful to the sheltered girl. Eventually Belle let her go in a twirl, and Cassandra held her back to the wall as Belle gave her an apologetic smile before putting on his mask again as the door slammed open. Hyacinthos stormed in, and Cassandra watched as the door was slowly closed behind him by an invisible force. The girl nervously pressed herself against the wall as he angrily shouted, All right, you airheaded little bitch. I've got enough on my plate trying to deal with those idiotic Soma slaves, those incompetent devil mercenaries, and now my own familia falling apart. I do not need to hear about your idiotic dreams in the middle of a debrief. He lifted his hand as if to strike her face, only to have his feet knocked out from underneath him, sending him sprawling onto his front as Cassandra subconsciously muffled her terrified scream. She knew that she could have screamed for the gods. This was her last chance. But maybe, just maybe, the kind devil would save her from this familia. Hyacinthos was about to shout before an invisible hand covered his mouth and a wound opened in his right shoulder. Bell became visible as he whispered admonishingly, a coolness in his eyes. Cassandra paled as she stared at his expression, so far removed from the kind warmth from before. That's no way to treat a lady. The captain looked up at Bell in fear as the boy stabbed the other shoulder blade, gritting his teeth as the man bit down into his hand in a bid to scream. Fumbling for his target's weapon, Bell threw the wavy blade away to the side before holding his knife just in front of the captain's face and whispering intimidatingly as the red blood dripped in front of his face. "Do you surrender? Or do I need to take a few fingers?" Bell was sick with himself as he tortured the man, but Koneko had been very clear that this was a necessity. Hyacinthos' profile told them that he was an Apollo fanatic, and if the message was not painful and clear, it would only prolong the suffering. He looked up at him with defiant eyes, and Bell pressed the knife against his cheek, drawing a line of blood as Cassandra looked down at him in horror, shaking her head as if to ask him to stop. "Look, it's not just you. If you don't surrender now, I'll have my mistress send your precious god back to Tenkai where you can't follow him. Well, after an appropriate punishment has been levied against him." Hyacinthos' eyes widened as the knife pushed deeper into his cheek, and he nodded his assent fervently, not caring about the knife sliding against his cheek. The tolling of bells could be heard across the field, signaling the defeat of the castle's defenders as Bell stood up and wiped the blood from his face as Hyacinthos stayed on the ground, crying tears of frustration as Bell uncorked a high potion from the Mayak familiar, pouring it into the captain's wounds as Cassandra breathed heavily. "Be Bell." He looked up at the girl as she whispered and bowed his head apologetically. "I'm sorry you had to see that. I didn't like it either. Please believe me." Cassandra looked between her now-healed captain and the source of her current mixed emotions. Reconciling the kind devil and that demon wasn't easy, but when she heard his words, she whispered with a slow nod, though she was still terrified. "Oh, okay." He smiled gratefully up at her as the door burst open, revealing a distressed Daphne. "Cassandra, what's going on?" "Captain, what you?" She went to unsheath her sword before Hyacinthos bit out angrily, getting to his feet with a look of consternation. "We lose, overwhelmingly. Get medical attention to our familiar." "I'm so sorry, Lord Apollo." Bell smiled as Daphne rushed over and grabbed the girl in a hug before pulling back and looking back at him with a glare. "You didn't do anything to Cassandra, did you?" "Did he do anything, Cassandra?" "I promise, loss or not, I'll make him pay." She was shocked when she heard her friend let out a soft giggle, and stepped back as she turned to the enemy assassin with a soft smile, doing her best to suppress her fear. "See can we meet again, Bell?" Bell nodded with a soft smile, bowing slightly as he sheathed his knife. "Of course, Cassandra. Come and visit any time. Well, I guess I should get back to my peerage. Thank you for the dance." He left, feeling a little sorry for the girl as Daphne suddenly shouted in a mix of confusion and surprise as Cassandra tried to explain what had happened. He never thought Ria's teasing would eventually lead him to be confident enough to do something like that. Or maybe he was just an idiot. Walking out into the sunlight, Bell was suddenly glumped by himself. "Master Bell." Laughing, he picked up the one person who would use that name and shouted excitedly. "Lily, you did great. I didn't see a single person on my way." Lefia would have walked over to congratulate him, but her mind was currently shutting down at the sight of two bells standing before her. The two turned to her curiously after a second, and one of them, she couldn't tell which, asked her, "Lefia, is something wrong?" The elf's nose suddenly burst red as she averted her eyes, trying to purge the thought of herself between two of the boy, though that just gave way of the images of herself also getting sandwiched by two of her beloved Miss Wallenstein. Lily shrugged and her body was engulfed with light, revealing her usual form, and the elf sighed in relief, turning to Bell with a slight smile. "You were quicker than I'd thought. What happened?" Bell frowned and scratched the back of his hair, remembering the sickening feeling of Cassandra's fearful eyes and the feeling of his knife piercing Hyacinthos. "Let's just say I did what needed to be done. Shall we meet up back at the cat?" At that, another voice spoke up from in front of them. "Yes, good job on the assassination. Is he dead?" Bell turned to Koneko, giving up on trying to let go of Lily as the girl just seemed to cling to him like a koala. "No, I had a good opportunity to get him alone, and got him to surrender. Your strategy worked amazingly, Miss Tuju." Despite herself, Koneko gave him a small smile and replied, turning away from them as she said, "Call me Koneko, you're a member of the peerage after all. Come on." The three began to walk towards the gate, Lily still not letting go of Bell much to Lefia's consternation and envy. Meanwhile, back in Babel, Riaz was halfway between laughing at the look on Apollo's face and the method by which Bel had gotten that girl on his side and despairing at Loki's cackling laughs. Sighing, she stood up and walked over to Apollo as Hermes called from the front with a snicker. Well, the captain surrendered, so it's Riaz Gremory's victory. Now then, Loki, I believe you have the transcript from the Donatus? Care to read Apollo's bet? Loki pulled out the scroll with a smile of glee as Apollo suddenly paled. Well then, according to this, I care not for what she asks for. Aye, how do you want to fill in your blank check? Riaz smiled down thankfully at her before crossing her arms while standing over Apollo as the god nervously tried to appease her. See, come on now, it was just a bit of fun, right? He's quite the hot commodity. He was silenced by her speaking up coldly. All of your assets, including familiar funds and properties, are henceforth the property of myself to do with as I please. Your familiar is hereby disbanded and you are forbidden from blessing anything again. Additionally, you are banished from Ororio, and you are forbidden from returning. Everybody was silent as they heard the damning terms of the punishment as Riaz leaned down and stared him directly in the eyes. Understand this, Apollo, you endangered someone dear to me. And let this be a lesson to all of you. I do not take kindly to those that endanger my children, let alone take them from me. Apollo, you have until tomorrow. The god in question shakily stood up and began to stumble towards the door as the silent crowd began to whisper among themselves. Riaz walked back over and sat down in her seat, only for Milikas to shout in admiration. That was so cool, Aunt Riaz. She smiled down at him and ruffled his hair. Thank you, Milikas, I try. It's nice to know that I can still compete with Bel in that regard. Serzex chuckled at that comment before asking curiously. So what do you plan on doing with the Apollo fortune? They must have millions of Valis in reserve, not to mention magical items. Riaz leaned on her hand, smiling thoughtfully as Loki sat down next to them, crossing her legs. What to do indeed. No doubt the liquid assets will match my own, even after hiring all those mercenaries. Their manor is undoubtedly more splendorous than the peerage's house. Perhaps a relocation there is in order. I have no doubt I could have Mother renovate it to our standards. She has quite the eye for decoration after all. Loki, your thoughts? The goddess grinned and leaned forward, replying, I'm sure my kids would like a few nights to themselves. Make one of those spare rooms into a drunk tank for me, would J.A. The girl sighed fondly before replying with a thoughtful nod. Perhaps a visitor's wing would be a good idea, or maybe a recreation and dormitory wing. In any case, I'll confirm the plans with my peerage beforehand. Now then, before I leave, Riaz stood up and walked over to where the Loki familiar was sitting and discussing the events excitedly and looked down at AIS, who was still staring out at the castle as the defeated forces began to desert it. AIS Wallenstein, I just wanted to thank you for your contribution to Bel's growth. She looked up at the devil in surprise before mumbling. I didn't do anything. Riaz sighed and replied knowingly. You do more for his growth than even I do, and that's just because of your existence. Remember that you are always welcome in my territories. I'm certain Bel would enjoy a visit at some point. Oh, and one other thing. She looked over to where Beat was grinning satisfied down at a massive pile of gold he'd accrued from the bet taker. I'll be sure to let Bel know he had your vote of confidence. Beat tried to call after her as Riaz left the room with a smirk. It was a short walk back to the house, but considering the number of citizens and journalists cheering and asking her questions, she decided to simply fly over the horde. Arriving at the house, she walked into the quiet building and sat at her desk, her fingers running over the old wood with a nostalgic smile. In short order she heard the front door open again, and the soft clacking of shoes against the wooden floor. The door to the office opened, revealing Bel, Lily, Mikoto, Koneko and Aquino. The boy walked forward first and gave her a soft smile, speaking up first. We're back. Riaz stood up and walked around the desk, pulling the boy into a soft embrace as she whispered. Welcome home, all of you. Oh, come on, you lot, get in here. Chapter notes curtains close and she's done. Lovely, thanks for reading this far if indeed you have. This has been a bit of a challenge to myself after the plot bunny left, but it's done for now. If reception's good I'll start it up again, but for now I'm going to focus on exams until Persona 5 Strikers comes out. See you next year, folks. The sound of construction covered the former Apollo familiar's home as devil workers continued their renovation of the manor. Bel sat at a temporary table, nervously accepting a cup of tea from Aquino as he stared up at the manor in amazement. Sure, it wasn't anything as opulent as the Gremory family estate, but the fact that it was theirs was incredible. Aquino sat down next to him as she said happily, "This is quite the upgrade, no? Ria's always said that house would be enough for us." Belle nodded with a grin. "Why, yeah, but at least we're keeping there, even if it's being rented to the Takemikazuchi familia. It was the first place I met all of you after all." Aquino cooed and leaned her cheek against his hair, nuzzling into him as he tried to pull away. "Oh, such a sweetheart, as usual. Don't worry, we'll be making plenty of new memories here as well." He gulped at the insinuation in her voice as a newly leveled 2 Lily sat down next to Belle with a sigh. "Aquino, leave him be. Master Belle, the funds have been split. Before renovations we received 16 million valis, though after we're at 12 million in liquid currency." He gaped at the massive sum as Lily snickered and leaned into his side. "Well, Apollo Familia has been active for many years and had over 100 members. I'd be surprised if they had any less." In other news, Mikoto is spending the day with Takemikazuchi Familia, Lefia has returned to Loki Familia and sends her thanks, and Koneko has disappeared into the dungeon. You never told me where she'd be going, but it's safe to say she's returned to the Hostess of Fertility. Belle nodded, mentally sending his thanks to the four for their assistance as he watched Rias set about coordinating the workers. He felt a small smile creep onto his face as she crossed her arms and looked up at the building proudly until he heard a voice call out from behind him quietly. EX accept. He turned around and blinked in shock when he saw both Daphne and Cassandra standing at the gate. Standing up, he extricated himself from the two girls much to their annoyance as he jogged over and gave the two a smile. "Hello, how can we help you two?" Cassandra was half hiding behind her friend, and Daphne sighed and spoke up apologetically. "I'm sorry about this. She wanted to come and ask for her favorite pillow. I tried telling her it's no good but she was silenced as Belle opened the gate and stood to the side invitingly. "It's fine, it's just a pillow after all. Do you have any idea where it would be?" Cassandra smiled up at him brightly as Daphne sighed in defeat. I think it should be in my old bedroom." Before he could continue, Rias walked over and said in amusement, "Already bringing girls home, Belle? I'd say I was surprised, but I'd be lying. How can we help you two?" Belle explained the situation and Rias nodded, turning back to the terrified Cassandra with an inviting smile. "Then please, come in and get it. Belle will go with you to make sure there aren't any problems. Just try not to disturb the workers if possible." Daphne was it. "Would you care to join us for a spot of tea in the meanwhile?" The redhead blinked in surprise before agreeing, following the devil towards the table where Aquino and Lily were sitting. Meanwhile, Belle and Cassandra made for the manor, walking among the workers as they carried logs and furniture around. Wow, this all looks so fancy." Belle laughed and scratched the back of his head, replying with a smile. "Yeah, the Gremory family is pretty upper class. It took me a while to get used to it. So, how are you two doing?" He said it with a hint of concern in his voice, and Cassandra waved him off fervently. Oh, we're fine. Daphne and I have a lot of money saved, so we stayed in a hotel last night, but we're still looking for a new familia." The two made small talk as they walked through the empty halls, and eventually they ended up in a room yet untouched by the workers. Cassandra's eyes lit up as she rushed over to pick up the sole pillow on the bed and hugged it to her torso tightly. Belle blinked in surprise as she looked up at him with the brightest smile he'd ever seen and said gratefully, "Thank you." Belle laughed and gave her a thumbs up. "It's no problem. Shall we go back downstairs? Aquino's just made some tea, and it's best served hot after all." Cassandra nodded fervently, keeping the pillow to her chest as they left the manor and walked over to the table. Another person had joined them, namely Aina, and she appeared to be going over something with Lily as Rias smiled up at them. Belle, Cassandra, I see you found it. Please, sit. It's about time for lunch anyways." They did so and Aina finished off, setting away a page as she picked up a teacup. "That should be all. Your guild tax will be deducted at the exchange, and any attempts to circumvent it will result in the aforementioned penalties. You just keep trying to make work for me, don't you, Belle?" The boy laughed nervously as he picked up his teacup once more while Aquino poured another for Cassandra. "Sorry, Aina. I try not to. So is there anything else to do today?" Rias shook her head and replied, "Seems not. The workers have the plans and they are my family's finest, so it's likely they'll be done by sunrise tomorrow. So it's going to be a rather slow day for us, though I don't doubt we could use one. Is there anything you wanted to do, Belle?" He crossed his arms and thought for a second before replying, "I don't really know. Head down into the dungeon." Rias sighed in defeat as she bemoaned, "I swear, you don't know how to stop, do you? Fine, Just be back before nightfall, and no lower than the 13th floor. I'm not about to let Lily go down there after being undercover for so long. Daphne's eyes suddenly widened as she asked, "Wait, undercover? Is that why one was more tolerable than usual?" Lily snickered as Bell stood up, his knife on his hip as he bowed and bade them all goodbye. Walking away and towards Babel, he didn't notice two pairs of eyes watching him from on high as he waved to the citizens of Ororio, considering he was now a household name. Hermes smiled as he leaned down on the balcony, saying in amusement, "Zeus' little grandson really is an interesting one, no? The son of the Captain Cranel and Materia the Saint, now the dancing devil of Gremory. I wonder what Zeus' face looks like right now, Freya." The goddess of beauty giggled, swirling a glass of wine as she replied with a smirk. "No doubt he'll be halfway between jealousy and pride. He always was the lecherous type. Now, the question of the day is what's next for my little hero? Him, what to do indeed." Hermes gave her a dark grin as he replied with a flourish. "Why, what can top having me poison his beloved mistress? Adultery? An insurmountable challenge? Shall we challenge his arm or his heart?" Freya smirked as she replied thoughtfully, "I wish to see something more. I wish to see that beautiful soul flare brighter than the sun itself, blinding in its brilliance. What do you propose?" Hermes hummed before stepping away from the balcony as if addressing a crowd. "Why, Freya, he has slain the evil monster, defeated the lecherous devil and subdued the arrogant god. What else can we do but challenge his resolve, that endless well of strength residing within him that allows him to overcome these challenges? To see if he has what it takes to carry on at the crossroads of his life. And what better foil for the hero?" He turned back to her with a dark, hungry look in his eyes, an expression that desired entertainment, that demanded the world show him a play that won't soon be forgotten. To be continued. Hope you enjoyed and look forwards to more. As usual, questions and ideas are welcome through reviews and PMS. Please drop by the archive and comment to let the creator know if you enjoyed their work.